I was just 9 years old when the two people who were supposed to protect me left me at a dusty Greyhound bus station with nothing but a crisp $10 bill and a lie that they would be right back. For 23 years, I was a ghost to them. I disappeared into the harsh reality of the foster system, channeling my absolute pain into cold survival, and eventually, into building an unshakable financial empire. Now I have returned to the very city they rule to face the family that threw me away like trash. And believe me, they have no idea the level of devastation that is about to hit them. My name is Isaiah Sterling. I am 32 years old, and this is the story of how I bought my family's sins and made them pay with absolute interest. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that karma always comes to collect, especially when you are the one delivering it. The Grand Ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Atlanta was a masterclass in performative wealth and calculated optics. Suspended from the towering ceiling, massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the 300 guests below. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck, expensive truffles, and the heavy, suffocating cloud of designer perfumes. This was the pinnacle of Atlanta's African-American elite society. Everyone who was anyone was here tonight. City council members, real estate developers, prominent attorneys, and the wealthiest socialites of Buckhead. They were all gathered for the annual charity gala of the Greater Light Megachurch, an event famous for its lavish displays of status thinly veiled as religious devotion. At the center of this opulent circus stood the architects of the evening, Pastor Calvin Sterling and First Lady Patricia Sterling, my parents. From my seat at a shadowed VIP table near the back of the room, I watched them work the crowd. I wore a tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit, devoid of flashy logos, my eyes concealed behind dark Tom Ford sunglasses. I sat perfectly still, observing the two people who had discarded me 23 years ago. Calvin looked exactly as I remembered, only more polished. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that hugged his shoulders perfectly, his silver hair cropped in a sharp, distinguished fade. His voice, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, boomed across the ballroom with the practiced hypnotic cadence of a man who sold salvation for a premium. Beside him, Patricia was the picture of pristine grace. She wore an emerald green silk gown that swept the floor, a diamond necklace resting heavily against her collarbone. Her smile was blindingly bright, radiating a manufactured warmth that fooled everyone in the room. Everyone except me. I swirling the ice in my crystal glass of aged bourbon, absorbing the sheer audacity of their performance. Calvin stepped up to the acrylic podium, gripping the edges with a dramatic flair. The room quieted down, the clinking of silverware against fine china coming to a complete halt. Brothers and sisters. Calvin began, his voice dropping an octave to convey deep spiritual weight. We are gathered here tonight not just to break bread, but to break ground on a new vision. The Greater Light Youth Annex will be a sanctuary for our community. But to build this sanctuary, we need your faith. And more importantly, we need your commitment. An usher stepped forward, carrying a velvet pillow. Resting on top of it was a literal brick painted entirely in gleaming gold. This is the golden brick, Calvin announced, gesturing broadly. It represents the foundation of our future. We are opening the silent auction for this symbolic cornerstone at $50,000. Who among you has the faith to lay the first stone for our youth? Who is ready to be a champion for the Lord tonight? The audacity was staggering. $50,000 for a painted piece of clay framed as a moral obligation. I watched the elite crowd shift uncomfortably. A few hands went to their checkbooks, but the exorbitant starting price caused a heavy, suffocating tension to settle over the room. Real estate tycoons looked at their wives. Politicians politely sipped their water. $50,000 was a steep price even for this crowd, especially when the economy was tightening. Calvin's smile remained fixed, but I could see the microscopic tightening of his jaw. The greedy sweat was beginning to form on his forehead. He needed this money. My private investigators had already briefed me on the church's heavily leveraged assets. This gala was a desperate cash grab disguised as philanthropy. $60,000. A voice called out from the front table. It was a local car dealership owner trying to secure his social standing. The crowd offered polite, relieved applause. "Do I hear 70? Calvin pushed his eyes, scanning the room with predatory hunger. "Do I hear 70,000 for the future of our children?" I placed my glass down on the table. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. I raised my bidding paddle, my movements slow and deliberate. $5 million. My voice was not a shout. It was a cold, commanding statement that sliced through the ambient noise of the ballroom like a surgical scalpel. I did not use a microphone yet. The acoustics of the silent room carried the words perfectly. $5 million. The reaction was visceral. The entire ballroom seemed to collectively stop breathing. The clinking of crystal champagne glasses ceased entirely. Heads snapped around so fast it was a wonder no one suffered whiplash. Whispers erupted immediately, sweeping through the tables like a wildfire. 5 million. Who is that? Did he say 5 million? The socialites of Buckhead strained their necks, trying to get a look at the man sitting in the shadows. On the stage, the transformation in Calvin and Patricia was magnificent to witness. Calvin's professional booming persona completely short-circuited. His jaw slackened and he gripped the podium so hard his knuckles turned white. He stared at the back of the room, desperately trying to calculate if this was a prank, a miracle, or a savior. Patricia's hand flew to her diamond necklace, her eyes widening to the size of saucers. $5 million in cash would not just build their annex. It would wipe out the secret shadow loans they were drowning in. Praise God! Calvin finally managed to stammer into the microphone, his voice cracking slightly. "We have a blessed bid of $5 million from the gentleman in the back. Sold. Sold to the glory of the future." The crowd erupted into thunderous standing applause. People were cheering, slapping the tables, completely unaware of the absolute destruction that had just been set in motion. I remained seated, my posture relaxed, my face completely impassive. Calvin and Patricia immediately stepped off the stage, abandoning the rest of their auction protocol. They practically sprinted across the ballroom floor, pushing past wealthy donors and city officials, desperate to secure their golden goose. They approached my table with overly sweet, fawning smiles, their eyes wide with predatory excitement. They saw a mysterious young tech tycoon. They saw a blank check. They saw their ultimate bailout. "Sir, words cannot express our gratitude," Calvin said, his voice dripping with sycophantic charm as he reached out a hand to shake mine. "Your generosity is truly a testament to your character. We are Pastor Calvin and First Lady Patricia Sterling. It is an absolute honor to welcome you to our family tonight." Patricia leaned in, her expensive floral perfume washing over me. "You have saved our vision, young man. God sent you to us tonight. What is your name, so we may properly thank you?" I looked at their outstretched hands. I did not move to shake them. Slowly, deliberately, I reached up and pulled off my dark Tom Ford sunglasses. I leaned forward into the warm light of the table centerpiece, allowing them to see my eyes clearly for the first time in 2 decades. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to look at the exact shape of my jaw, the specific arch of my brow, the face of the 9-year-old boy they had abandoned, now fully grown into a ruthless predator. The psychological warfare began the exact second the recognition hit them. It was instantaneous. The manufactured warmth vanished from Patricia's eyes, replaced by a raw, primal terror. The blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her ash gray beneath her expensive makeup. She stumbled backward, her designer heel catching on the carpet, nearly sending her crashing into the adjacent table. Calvin's outstretched hand began to tremble violently. The charismatic, booming mega-pastor looked as though all the air had been violently sucked from his lungs. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The greedy sweat on his forehead turned completely cold. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I did not complain about the years of foster care, the cold nights in youth shelters, or the hunger pains that had defined my childhood. Emotion was a vulnerability I had burned out of my system years ago. I simply raised a hand and signaled a passing waiter. "I will take another bourbon neat," I told the waiter, my voice perfectly level. The waiter nodded and hurried away, entirely oblivious to the monumental family crisis silently detonating at my table. I turned my attention back to the 2 trembling figures standing before me. I reached into the interior pocket of my suit jacket and retrieved a small flat object. It was a weathered, torn $10 bill carefully preserved and permanently sealed inside a thick plastic laminate. I placed it flat on the pristine white tablecloth and slowly slid it across the glass surface until it stopped directly in front of Calvin's trembling hands. "The last bill you shoved into my hands at the Greyhound station 23 years ago?" I said, my tone as casual as if I were discussing the weather. "Keep it. Your church looks like it desperately needs the loose change." Patricia looked frantically around the room. The nearby socialites were beginning to cast curious glances in our direction, sensing the bizarre shift in energy. Patricia's survival instinct kicked in, driven entirely by her obsession with optics and public standing. She forced a rigid, terrifyingly fake smile onto her face for the benefit of the onlookers, while frantically whispering to me through gritted teeth, "Isaiah." She hissed, her voice vibrating with panic. "What are you doing here? How did you get in here? The Lord says we must forgive those who trespass against us. We did what we had to do to make you strong. It was God's plan for your life." She was actually quoting scripture out of context to mask her absolute terror. It was a masterclass in narcissistic deflection. I took a slow sip of my freshly delivered bourbon, letting the liquid burn down my throat. "Do not blaspheme in front of me, Patricia," I replied softly. "God did not tell you to leave your son at a bus stop so you could rebrand your image for a megachurch congregation. You threw me away because I was an inconvenience to your ascension. And now I am the man holding a $5 million leash around your neck." Calvin finally found his voice, though it was barely a raspy whisper. "You do not have $5 million. You are playing a sick game. You are trying to humiliate us." Before I could systematically break down exactly how much capital I controlled, a sharp, familiar voice cut through the tension. "Mom, Dad, what is going on over here? Is there a problem with the donation?" I looked up. Approaching the table was Chloe Sterling Davenport, my older sister. She was 35 now, dripping in luxury. She wore a vintage black Chanel dress that screamed old money, her wrists adorned with Cartier bangles. She had always been the golden child, the perfect compliant daughter, who fit seamlessly into Calvin and Patricia's fraudulent narrative of family perfection. Walking closely behind her was her husband, Jamal Davenport. Jamal was 38, a tall, imposing man wearing a velvet tuxedo jacket and a massive diamond-encrusted Audemars Piguet watch that I immediately recognized as a high-end fake. Jamal was a well-known figure in the Atlanta nightlife scene, the owner of a supposedly exclusive high-rolling club. But my intelligence team had already ripped apart his financial facade. Jamal was drowning. His club was hemorrhaging cash, his suppliers were demanding payment, and he was secretly facing Chapter 11 bankruptcy. He was a desperate man wearing the costume of a king. Chloe stopped dead in her tracks as she registered my face. Her eyes darted from the laminated $10 bill on the table to the terrified faces of our parents, and finally to me. The realization hit her, but unlike our parents, Chloe's reaction was an ugly cocktail of shock and immediate defensive arrogance. "Isaiah," she spat out, looking me up and down, scrutinizing my unbranded suit. "What is this? Is this some kind of stunt? Are you the one making fake bids to embarrass the ministry?" Jamal, however, was playing an entirely different game. Unlike Chloe, who only saw the little brother she used to torment, Jamal smelled blood in the water. More specifically, he smelled money. He had seen me bid $5 million without flinching. He did not care about the family history, the abandonment, or the psychological trauma unfolding before him. He only cared about survival, and he saw me as a massive floating life raft. Jamal smoothly stepped in front of his wife, pasting a wide, charismatic, fiercely fake smile onto his face. He extended a hand toward me, projecting the ultimate image of brotherhood and warmth. "Isaiah, man. It has been way too long," Jamal said, his voice booming with forced familiarity. "We thought we had lost you to the wind, brother. Look at you rolling back into the city like a boss. $5 million on the drop, that is heavy. That is boss-level movement right there." I looked at his outstretched hand. I noted the slight tremor in his fingers, the subtle signs of a man crushed by the weight of unpayable debts. I smiled, a dead, hollow smile that did not reach my eyes. I reached out and shook his hand firmly, letting him feel the absolute confidence in my grip. "Jamal," I said smoothly, "it is good to see the family doing so well. I hear your club is the talk of the town." Jamal's chest puffed out, inflating with his own false hype. "You know it, brother. We run the city nightlife. The Onyx Room is strictly VIP, strictly elite. Listen, we cannot catch up properly in this stiff environment. You need to come down to the club tomorrow night. Let me host you. Let me put you in the owner's booth. We need to talk business. We need to talk family. We need to reconnect the right way." Behind him, Patricia was staring at Jamal as if he had lost his mind. She wanted me gone, buried back in whatever forgotten corner of the world I had emerged from. Chloe was glaring at me with deep suspicion, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. But Jamal was desperate, and his greed was overriding any sense of caution or loyalty to his in-laws. He was practically begging a predator to step into his home. I maintained my calm, measured expression. I knew exactly what Jamal was doing. He wanted to pitch me. He wanted to use the illusion of family reconciliation to extract a massive investment to save his sinking ship. He thought he was playing the slick street smart older brother manipulating the long-lost emotionally vulnerable sibling. He had absolutely no idea that my firm had already acquired the commercial lease on his nightclub. He had no idea I was already his landlord. "I would love to, Jamal," I replied, picking up the laminated $10 bill and sliding it back into my suit pocket. "I think a family reunion is exactly what we all need right now. Let us talk business tomorrow night." Jamal grinned, clapping me on the shoulder with exaggerated affection. "That is what I am talking about. Blood is thicker than water, right? We are going to do big things together. Isaiah, mark my words." I looked past Jamal, meeting my father's terrified, unblinking stare. Calvin knew. Even if Jamal was too foolish and desperate to see the trap, Calvin's survival instincts were screaming at him. He recognized the absolute danger standing in front of him. "I agree, Jamal," I said softly, never breaking eye contact with my father. "We are going to do monumental things together. Have a blessed evening. Pastor First Lady, Chloe, I will see you all very soon." I turned and walked away from the table, my posture perfectly straight, my steps measured. The gala continued around me, the elite attendees completely ignorant of the fact that the most powerful family in their circle had just been marked for absolute systematic financial destruction. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the execution was about to begin. The Sterling estate in Buckhead sat behind towering wrought iron security gates, acting as a sprawling limestone monument to tax-exempt greed. Walking through the massive double mahogany front doors felt exactly like entering a modern pharaoh's tomb. The grand foyer featured a sweeping double staircase flanking a custom-painted oil portrait of Calvin and Patricia that stood at least 8 feet tall. Every square inch of the mansion was carefully designed to intimidate visitors and project an overwhelming aura of divine prosperity. The formal dining room was even more offensive. A massive cascading crystal chandelier, which likely cost more than the average congregant earned in an entire decade, hung ominously over a 20-seat dining table carved from a single slab of imported Brazilian mahogany. Tonight, however, we sat at one extreme end of it. We were a small, tense cluster of 5 people surrounded by vast, echoing excess. The heavy gold leaf trim on the crown molding caught the ambient light, gleaming with the hard-earned tithes of single mothers, working-class families, and devout seniors who genuinely believed they were buying favor with God. I took my assigned seat at the table. The china was bone white with real gold edging. The silverware was heavy, ornate, and polished to a blinding shine. Everything in this room screamed of a desperate, unchecked misuse of congregation funds. I placed my thick linen napkin on my lap and remained completely silent, observing the absolute toxicity radiating from the people who shared my bloodline. Patricia sat at the opposite end of the table wearing a different but equally expensive emerald silk dress for what was supposed to be a quiet Sunday family dinner. She folded her manicured hands together, resting them under her chin, and flashed her flawless, unnaturally white veneers. "Isaiah," she began, her voice immediately adopting that melodic, highly practiced cadence she utilized for televised sermons and emotional charity appeals. The Lord works in mysterious and profound ways. You must know that we have wept for you. We have prayed for your safety every single night since you left us. When we had to let you go, you must understand it was not out of malice or cruelty. It was a divine test of faith. We saw a rebellious, untamed spirit in you that desperately needed to be forged in the fire of the real world. God spoke to us clearly and told us that keeping you in this house of luxury and comfort would only weaken your soul and blind you to your true potential. We had to release you so the Lord could break you down and build you back up into a strong man, a conqueror, a king. We made the ultimate parental sacrifice by letting you face the wilderness. And look at you now. You return to us successful and wealthy. The Lord's plan is always perfect, and our tough love was the catalyst for your greatness. She smiled warmly, entirely convinced by her own twisted religious gaslighting. She was flawlessly using scripture to sanitize child abandonment, framing a heinous, unforgivable crime as a holy sacrifice. She genuinely believed her own performance. Chloe scoffed loudly from across the table, swirling a heavy pour of imported Pinot Noir in her crystal glass. She was draped in Gucci from head to toe, the interlocking logos screaming for attention and validating her fragile sense of self-worth. She eyed my suit with visible, unrestrained disdain. I was wearing a bespoke hand-tailored piece from Savile Row crafted from pure vicuna wool. It was entirely devoid of any visible branding or flashy hardware. To her untrained label-obsessed eyes, it looked painfully plain. To those who truly understood stealth wealth, it cost more than her entire seasonal wardrobe combined. A king. Chloe mocked, taking a slow sip of her wine and resting her elbows on the mahogany table. Let us not get carried away, Mother. Anyone can hit a lucky streak in the market or front borrowed cash at a charity gala just to make a scene. I mean, look at him. You bid $5 million last night, but you show up to a Buckhead family dinner looking like a mid-level accountant. No luxury watch, no designer labels, no real presence. If you are actually doing so well, you should let Jamal take you shopping tomorrow afternoon. Jamal knows real luxury. The Onyx Room is currently pulling in the highest tier of Atlanta's elite. Celebrities, athletes, politicians. We just ordered a massive fleet of custom Maybachs for our VIP transport service to match the new aesthetic of the club. Real wealth shows itself, Isaiah. You have to spend money to prove you actually belong in this circle. I ignored her desperate insults entirely. I calmly picked up my heavy silver knife and fork, cut a precise piece of my dry, aged steak, and chewed it slowly. I let the suffocating silence stretch out across the dining room, absorbing their deep flaws, their crippling insecurities, and their pathetic need to perform for me. I swallowed, dabbed the corners of my mouth with the linen napkin, and placed my silverware down perfectly parallel on the china plate. Custom Maybachs. I said, my voice completely flat, lacking any trace of emotion. I spoke softly, forcing all four of them to lean forward slightly, just to hear me. That is a remarkably bold expenditure, Jamal. Especially considering the Onyx Room's primary liquor distributor, Southern Spirits, filed a formal legal lien against your operating LLC last Tuesday for exactly $85,000 in unpaid invoices. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip, holding Jamal's gaze over the rim. Jamal abruptly choked on his wine. He coughed violently, his face turning a deep, unhealthy shade of crimson as he grabbed his napkin to wipe his chin. Chloe's smug, condescending smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. What are you talking about? Chloe snapped, looking back and forth between us. Jamal, what is he talking about? Jamal wiped his mouth, his eyes darting frantically toward Calvin for salvation. It is just a clerical error, babe. Jamal stammered, his confident swagger completely evaporating in a matter of seconds. Just a minor mix-up with the accounting software and the bank. I will have my finance guy handle it tomorrow morning. It is nothing to worry about. A clerical error, I repeated smoothly, leaning back in my chair. Fascinating. I suppose the Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing your defense attorney drafted 3 days ago is also a clerical error. Or the undeniable fact that your commercial lease is exactly 90 days in arrears, which automatically triggers the property default clause by the end of this week. Jamal's face lost all its color. He looked physically ill, staring at me, as if I were a grim reaper who had just crawled out of his own grave to collect a debt. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but no words materialized. I turned my cold gaze away from him and locked eyes with my father. Calvin was sitting rigidly at the head of the table, his posture unnaturally stiff. "And it makes me wonder, Pastor," I continued, my tone conversational but absolutely lethal. "How does a failed club owner on the absolute brink of total liquidation secure a sudden line of credit to keep the lights on and buy a fleet of luxury vehicles? Traditional banks would not touch him. Private equity firms would laugh him out of the boardroom. He would absolutely need a wealthy guarantor. He would need someone with substantial unencumbered assets to back a shadow loan. Say, for example, a megachurch with a prime real estate deed owned entirely free and clear." Calvin dropped his silver knife. It clattered loudly against his china plate, the sharp sound echoing violently in the cavernous dining room. Patricia's perfectly manicured hands gripped the thick edge of the mahogany table so tightly that her knuckles turned stark white. The grand illusion of their holy empire was fracturing right before their eyes. "The highly publicized expansion project for your new youth annex," I said, steepling my fingers and studying my father's terrified, wide eyes. "You told your loyal congregation last night that you desperately needed $5 million in cash to break ground and secure the future of the community. But closed-door financial records show you secretly took out a massive shadow loan against the church's deed 6 months ago. You secured a high-yield mezzanine loan from a private lender at a brutal 14% interest rate. You did not take that money to build a youth center, Calvin. You illegally leveraged the house of God to bail out your son-in-law's failing nightclub, and now the balloon payment is due." I watched the absolute terror paralyze them. No one spoke. The grand, ostentatious dining room felt like it was rapidly shrinking, the walls closing in on their fraudulent empire. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger. I simply laid out the factual financial architecture of their impending demise piece by piece while calmly enjoying the rest of my meal. I left the Buckhead mansion that night, leaving behind a suffocating silence that tasted like pure terror. Less than 12 hours later, I stood inside my penthouse office in downtown Atlanta. The space was a masterclass in ruthless efficiency. Floor-to-ceiling smart glass offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, filtering out the harsh morning glare to cast a cool, calculating blue light across the polished concrete floors. There was no gold leaf here, no oil portraits, just an oversized slate desk, a bank of encrypted servers, and a holographic display table humming with real-time global market data. Xavier, my lead attorney and chief financial architect, stood on the opposite side of the display table. Xavier was a former corporate raider who wore sharp, bespoke suits and possessed a mind that functioned like a predatory algorithm. He tapped a glass screen, sending a flurry of complex financial schematics hovering into the air between us. "The Sterling Empire is a staggering house of cards," Xavier began, his voice devoid of any inflection. He swiped a dense legal document onto the main screen. "Let us start with Jamal Davenport. The Onyx Room is completely insolvent. His operational cash flow dried up 8 months ago. To cover his massive monthly burn rate, he executed a series of desperate merchant cash advances, effectively leveraging his future unearned credit card receipts at exorbitant discount rates. Those lenders are now sweeping his merchant accounts daily, draining every dollar before it even hits his ledger. He is currently drafting a Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing, attempting to secure an automatic stay from a federal judge to halt the asset liquidation process. But his debt-to-equity ratio is completely unsalvageable. His liabilities exceed his assets by an astonishing margin. He has officially defaulted on his senior secured debt, and his mezzanine lenders are actively preparing to execute their equity warrants to seize the entire business." I crossed my arms, staring at the glowing red numbers indicating Jamal's catastrophic negative cash flow. "He is drowning," I stated flatly. "He is already dead," Xavier corrected, pulling up a secondary heavily encrypted file. "But the true catastrophe is how your parents attempted to resuscitate a corpse." When Jamal hit his ultimate liquidity crisis, Pastor Calvin and Patricia panicked. A public Chapter 11. Filing for their son-in-law would shatter the immaculate prosperity gospel narrative they sell to their massive congregation. To prevent the brand damage and keep the tithes flowing, they bypassed traditional commercial banks, knowing the rigorous underwriter scrutiny would expose their own over-leveraged positions. Instead, they went directly to the unregulated shadow banking sector. Xavier highlighted a heavily redacted loan origination document. They secured a $2.5 million bridge loan from a private equity syndicate that specializes in distressed asset exploitation. The terms are aggressively predatory. A 14% compounding interest rate, a severe prepayment penalty, and a strict balloon payment due in less than 48 hours. And the collateral I asked already, knowing the answer but wanting to hear the exact legal mechanism spoken aloud. Xavier's eyes locked onto mine. Cross-collateralization. They pledged the unencumbered deed to the Greater Light Mega Church Annex property, along with a secondary lien on their personal Buckhead estate. If they default on this massive balloon payment, the private equity syndicate triggers a rapid non-judicial foreclosure. They will seize the church property and the family home simultaneously. The Sterling family will be homeless and completely stripped of their ministry assets by Monday morning. I walked slowly around the glass table, analyzing the cascading failures of their financial architecture. They were bleeding cash from every conceivable artery. Xavier brought up Patricia's personal investment portfolio. The First Lady has been attempting to generate fast liquidity through high-frequency options trading, Xavier explained, tapping a graph that plummeted sharply into the red zone. She was heavily exposed on margin betting on volatile pharmaceutical stocks. When the sector corrected last quarter, her brokerage issued immediate margin calls. To cover those calls and avoid forced liquidation of her blue-chip assets, she tapped into a revolving line of credit tied directly to the church's charitable foundation. She is actively commingling tax-exempt, non-profit donations with her personal speculative trading accounts. That is not just severe financial mismanagement, Isaiah. That is textbook embezzlement and federal wire fraud. If the Internal Revenue Service or the Securities and Exchange Commission audits that charitable foundation, Calvin and Patricia are looking at severe federal prison sentences. They are living entirely on a massive, unsustainable credit bubble. I concluded, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Every luxury car, every designer gown, every charity gala is funded by toxic debt, stolen capital, and borrowed time. The digital displays illuminated the dark reality of my bloodline. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with terrifying clarity. I thought back to the Ritz-Carlton gala. I thought about the desperate, hungry look in Patricia's eyes when I bid $5 million in cash. I thought about Jamal sweating through his fake luxury suit, eagerly inviting me to his failing club to discuss a sudden equity partnership. They did not invite me to that dinner to reconcile, I said, staring at the pulsing red numbers of their impending defaults. They do not feel an ounce of remorse for abandoning a 9-year-old boy at a bus station. They do not see a son who miraculously survived the foster system. They see a sovereign wealth fund. They see a pristine, untapped balance sheet ready to be exploited. Xavier nodded grimly, swiping away the church documents to reveal a newly intercepted email chain between Jamal and his defense attorney. Jamal is currently drafting a fraudulent joint venture contract for your meeting tonight at the VIP lounge. He intends to frame it as a lucrative buy-in for his nightclub. The contract is buried in dense corporate legalese, but the core mechanism is a toxic liability transfer hidden within a subordination agreement and a capital contribution clause. He expects you to inject $2 million in raw capital, which his documents legally classify as a non-refundable equity buy-in rather than a secured loan. If you sign it, you legally absorb his senior debt obligations while forfeiting any real operational control over the Onyx Room. They want to use your verified liquid assets to immediately satisfy their aggressive shadow creditors, while leaving you holding an empty, worthless shell corporation. You are their targeted bailout, an ignorant piggy bank they plan to smash open to fix their own catastrophic failures. The psychological weight of the revelation settled heavily over the high-tech office. For 23 years, I had built my empire on the foundational belief that my parents had discarded me simply because I was an unwanted burden. I had hardened my heart, transforming my childhood trauma into premium fuel for absolute success. Yet stepping back into their world, the ultimate truth was infinitely more grotesque. They were not just cruel, they were predatory parasites. They had stripped their devoted congregation blind, leveraged their holy sanctuary for pure vanity, and now facing total systemic financial ruin, they fully intended to strip mine, their discarded son, to save their fraudulent kingdom. Isaiah Xavier said quietly, breaking the silence. We have enough documentary evidence right here to trigger a federal grand jury investigation. I can forward the commingled foundation ledgers to the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crimes Division today. We can have Calvin and Patricia in federal custody before the weekend begins. The private equity firm will seize the church. The commercial banks will foreclose on Jamal. We can walk away right now and let the legal system obliterate them entirely. I turned away from the digital table and looked out the massive glass windows at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The morning sun was glaring off the skyscrapers, casting long, sharp shadows across the city blocks. Calling the authorities would be clean. It would be highly efficient. It would be entirely unsatisfying. I did not spend over 2 decades crawling out of the gutter just to let a federal prosecutor take the final shot, I replied slowly, adjusting the cuffs of my custom suit. Arresting them is a simple bureaucratic procedure. They would spin it. They would play the ultimate victims. Calvin would stand in front of a judge and claim religious persecution. Patricia would cry on national television. Jamal would blame systemic disadvantages. They would weave their financial crimes into a grand martyrdom narrative for their loyal flock. I turned back to Xavier, my expression carved from solid ice. No, I want total systemic annihilation. I want them to build their own scaffold, and I want to be the one who pulls the lever. What is the exact directive? Xavier asked, his hands hovering over the encrypted terminal keyboard, ready to execute my orders. I walked back to the table and pressed my hand flat against the glowing display of the church's shadow loan. Do not call the authorities yet. Contact the private equity syndicate holding the church's debt. I want to buy that entire loan portfolio immediately, and I will pay a heavy premium to expedite the transfer. Wire the funds directly from my primary holding company. Next, execute a hostile takeover of the regional bank holding the primary mortgage on the Buckhead mansion. Buy up a controlling stake of their distressed debt packages if you have to. Lock down every single lien, every margin call, every uncollateralized line of credit tied to the Sterling name. I want their credit cards, their automotive leases, and their private wealth management accounts completely frozen the exact second I give the ultimate signal. Xavier's eyes widened slightly as the sheer devastating scale of the operation dawned on him. You are going to become their sole creditor. I am going to own everything they breathe on, I stated with absolute terrifying conviction. By the time I step into Jamal's club tonight to look at his pathetic contract, I want to be the legal owner of the very ground he stands on. Prepare the transfer papers, Xavier. We are going to let them think they are setting a brilliant trap. We are going to let them hand me the noose. It was a flawlessly designed execution. I would show them exactly what happens when you abandon a child and attempt to manipulate a grown man. Xavier gave a sharp professional nod, his fingers flying across the terminal to execute the hostile corporate acquisitions. The digital screens around us shifted rapidly from red liability warnings to green acquisition confirmations. The shadow debt was being transferred. The banking lines were being aggressively secured. The Sterling family was desperately treading water trying to stay afloat, completely unaware that the ocean they were swimming in now belonged entirely to me. Across the city 10 miles north of my downtown stronghold, the Davenport residence was suffocating under the invisible crushing weight of imminent financial ruin. The 6-bedroom modern architectural marvel sat on a meticulously manicured acre in the heart of Buckhead. From the street, the pristine limestone exterior projected an image of absolute, untouchable elite status. But inside the expansive home office, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of stale liquor and raw, unfiltered panic. Jamal Davenport was sweating profusely, the moisture glistening against his dark skin under the harsh glare of an antique brass desk lamp. The collar of his designer dress shirt was completely unbuttoned, his expensive silk tie discarded carelessly on a velvet chaise lounge. He stared at the glowing screen of his MacBook Pro, his bloodshot eyes frantically scanning the dense, convoluted blocks of legal text. He was operating purely on adrenaline and blind desperation, attempting to execute a financial maneuver that was as illegal as it was pathetic. Beside him, Chloe paced the length of the imported Persian rug like a caged animal. She held a heavy crystal glass filled to the brim with straight vodka, her knuckles turning stark white from the tension of her grip. She was still wearing her vintage Chanel dress from the charity gala, refusing to take it off, clinging to the expensive fabric as if it were a physical suit of armor protecting her against the impending reality of poverty. Jamal was actively piecing together a fraudulent operating agreement. He was not a corporate lawyer, but he was a seasoned, highly manipulative con artist who had survived in Atlanta by selling illusions. He had downloaded a complex boilerplate joint venture template from the internet and was aggressively modifying the indemnification clauses. He typed furiously, crafting an equity partnership structure that looked incredibly lucrative on the surface. The heavily doctored document promised a 40% ownership stake in the Onyx Room in exchange for a $2 million initial capital contribution. However, buried deep within the fine print hidden beneath layers of deliberately convoluted corporate jargon was a highly toxic liability transfer. The specific clause stipulated that the new equity partner would immediately assume full personal liability for all of the nightclub's existing senior secured debt. Jamal was attempting to legally handcuff me to his sinking ship. If I signed that paper, my clean, verified liquid assets would be instantly drained by the banks to satisfy his angry creditors, and I would be left holding a worthless, bankrupt shell of a company. Chloe stopped pacing and leaned over Jamal's shoulder, her eyes narrowing as she read the glowing screen. "Make sure the capital contribution clause is strictly irrevocable," she snapped, taking a sharp, desperate sip of her drink. "He cannot have any legal loophole to pull the funds back once the wire transfer clears the escrow account. We need that $2 million locked in before the commercial banks open on Monday morning." Jamal wiped a thick bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "I am burying the liability assumption in Section 4, sub-paragraph C," he muttered, his fingers shaking slightly as they hovered over the keyboard. "He will not see it. He is a venture capitalist, sure, but he is looking for a family reunion. He is highly emotional right now. He just dropped $5 million at a church gala simply to impress our parents and make a statement. He wants to belong to us again. We play entirely on that psychological weakness. We give him the big brother routine, pour him some extremely expensive scotch, make him feel respected, and he will sign right on the dotted line without bringing in outside counsel to read the fine print." Chloe scoffed loudly, her lip curling into a visceral sneer of pure entitlement. "He is just trying to buy his way back into our good graces. It is pathetic, really. He thinks throwing money around makes up for the fact that he was always the problem child. But if his desperate need for our validation keeps my luxury cars in the driveway and the collection agencies off our backs, I will play the loving, supportive sister for one night. Just print the damn document, Jamal." While Jamal and Chloe hastily taped together their crude amateur financial bear trap, I was methodically dismantling the very ground they stood on. Back in my penthouse command center, the environment was completely devoid of panic stress or desperation. There was only the quiet, rhythmic hum of high-performance encrypted servers and the soft, precise tapping of Xavier executing my lethal commands. The holographic display table shifted from the club's isolated financial schematics to the broader, interconnected Sterling family asset portfolio. I was not simply investigating my parents and my sister. I was systematically swallowing their entire financial ecosystem whole. To execute a hostile debt acquisition of this massive magnitude, unprecedented speed, and absolute undeniable liquidity were required. The private equity syndicate that held the predatory shadow loan against the Greater Light megachurch was a ruthless, notoriously aggressive outfit based in Chicago. They did not care about religious salvation or community ministry. They cared entirely about quarterly yields and asset liquidation. Xavier had initiated direct contact with their managing partners under the guise of my primary anonymous holding corporation. We explicitly offered to purchase the entire $2.5 million promissory note at a staggering 20% premium payable immediately in untraceable cleared wire transfers. For a distressed asset fund, currently facing a potentially messy, highly publicized, and protracted religious foreclosure process in Georgia, an instant guaranteed premium cash exit was an offer they legally and practically could not refuse. I stood over the digital table watching the encrypted communication channels light up with incoming data. The Chicago syndicate had officially accepted the terms without hesitation. Xavier uploaded the digital transfer agreements onto the main server. I bypassed the standard time-consuming bureaucratic banking delays by executing the transaction entirely in raw cash equivalents. I placed my right thumb on the biometric scanner built seamlessly into the slate desk. A bright green confirmation bar flashed quickly across the main display. The funds successfully deployed. In a matter of seconds, $3 million left my accounts, and the total unencumbered ownership of the church's shadow debt transferred directly to my holding company. I was no longer just a discarded, forgotten son. I was the supreme creditor of the Greater Light megachurch. I held the sole legal right to foreclose on their sanctuary, their massive administration buildings, and the multi-million-dollar Buckhead mansion my parents had recklessly used as collateral. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of a high-end laser printer finally broke the tense silence in the Davenport mansion. Jamal watched eagerly as the thick ivory parchment paper slid smoothly into the output tray. He gathered the pages carefully, tapping them against the surface of the mahogany desk to align the edges perfectly. He slid the fraudulent joint venture contract into a sleek, black leather presentation folder. He ran his hand over the smooth leather cover, a sickening wide smile of relief spreading across his face. He actually believed he had outsmarted a man who built a venture capital empire from the concrete up. He genuinely believed his cheap, downloaded legal trap was going to successfully save his failing kingdom. "We are going to be absolutely fine," Chloe said, clinking her crystal glass against his. "By tomorrow night, that arrogant little boy is going to pay off every single one of our outstanding debts. We will restructure the club, rebrand the VIP section, and we will not have to change a single thing about our daily lifestyle. He owes us this, Jamal. After everything our parents went through, having to deal with his rebellious attitude when he was a kid, this is his ultimate debt to pay." The sheer, blinding delusion radiating from her was astounding. She had completely rewritten history in her mind, convincing herself that stealing my hard-earned capital was a righteous, justified form of familial taxation. While Jamal lovingly stroked his fake contract, Xavier was finalizing the last crucial phase of my absolute takeover. We had secured the church and the parents, but Jamal required his own specific customized brand of destruction. His nightclub, the Onyx Room, was the absolute epicenter of his false identity. It was his source of power, his social currency, and his primary tool for manipulating the Atlanta elite. To truly destroy him, I had to separate him from the physical property. The Onyx Room did not own the building it occupied. Jamal held a commercial lease with a prominent Atlanta real estate conglomerate. Because Jamal was exactly 90 days delinquent on his rent payments, the conglomerate had already initiated the preliminary legal stages of a commercial eviction process. Xavier reached out directly to the real estate firm's chief executive officer. We did not just offer to pay Jamal's substantial back rent to halt the eviction. We offered to purchase the entire commercial building outright, significantly above current market value, with a highly aggressive closing window of less than 4 hours. The real estate firm, eager to offload a severely delinquent tenant and secure a massive unexpected cash windfall, drafted the expedited commercial sale documents immediately. I watched the final digital confirmation populate on the holographic display. The commercial deed for the building housing the Onyx Room was now officially registered to a subsidiary corporation entirely under my direct control. I legally owned the walls, the floor, the roof, and the doors of Jamal's beloved sanctuary. Xavier stepped back from the terminal, calmly adjusting his tailored French cuffs. The acquisitions are completely finalized, Isaiah. He stated, his voice ringing with absolute undeniable finality. You hold the promissory note and the collateral deed for the Greater Light megachurch. You hold the secondary lien on Calvin and Patricia's primary residence. You hold the commercial deed for the Onyx Room. Furthermore, we have successfully frozen their auxiliary credit lines by triggering standard risk assessment protocols through our primary banking partners. They cannot access a single dollar of extended credit anywhere in the state. They are entirely isolated. They are standing directly on a trapdoor, and you are holding the release lever. I looked at the digital map of Atlanta glowing brightly on the table, red markers indicating the specific properties I had just conquered. My family was sleeping soundly across the city, completely unaware that their entire financial existence had been annexed while they plotted to steal my wealth. They were marching eagerly toward the VIP lounge tomorrow night, armed with a fraudulent contract, fully expecting to slaughter a sheep. They had absolutely no comprehension that they were walking directly into the jaws of an apex predator. The time for observation was officially over. The time for execution had arrived. I instructed Xavier to prepare the true transfer documents for the meeting. I was going to let Jamal pitch his pathetic scam. I was going to let him pour the expensive champagne and present his fraudulent paperwork. And then with the swift, merciless strike of a pen, I was going to legally obliterate him. The Onyx Room was a masterclass in aggressive mediocrity dressed up as high society. The heavy bass of the club's state-of-the-art sound system vibrated violently through the sticky floorboards, rattling the cheap acrylic chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. Every surface was covered in dark faux velvet and gold-painted plastic, trying desperately to emulate a lifestyle that Jamal could never truly afford. The air reeked of spilled vodka, cheap cologne, and the palpable desperation of people trying to look important. Xavier and I bypassed the massive line shivering in the damp Atlanta air, walking straight past the velvet ropes. The bouncers, recognizing the tailored authority in our stride, parted immediately without asking a single question. We were led up a narrow, dimly lit staircase to the owner's booth, an elevated glass enclosure overlooking the writhing dance floor below. Jamal and Chloe were already waiting. A bottle of what appeared to be vintage Dom Perignon sat in a silver ice bucket on the glass table, though my trained eye immediately recognized the flawed labeling of a counterfeit vintage. Jamal sprang up, his velvet jacket catching the strobe lights, throwing his arms wide in a grossly exaggerated display of brotherhood. Chloe remained seated, dabbing at the corners of her perfectly lined eyes, with a tissue already initiating the emotional performance they had rehearsed all afternoon. "Isaiah!" My brother Jamal bellowed over the thumping bass, gesturing to the plush leather seating. "Welcome to the Empire, the best seats in the house for the best man in the city." I sat down slowly, keeping my posture perfectly rigid, while Xavier stood silently behind my right shoulder carrying a slim leather briefcase. "I appreciate the hospitality, Jamal," I replied smoothly, ignoring the poured glass of fake champagne pushed toward me. Chloe let out a practiced, fragile sob, reaching across the table to gently touch my sleeve. "Isaiah, we are so incredibly sorry to spring this on you." So suddenly she whimpered, forcing a tear to escape and run down her cheek. "But the family is under attack. We are facing a temporary cash flow issue, just a minor hurdle, but it threatens everything Mom and Dad have built. We desperately need a $2 million bridge loan to secure the family legacy. Jamal has put together an amazing equity partnership for you. You save the family and you get a massive piece of the club. It is a win for everyone." Jamal eagerly slid the thick ivory parchment paper across the glass table. The binder was embossed with a gold logo. He handed me a heavy Mont Blanc pen, smiling with the manic energy of a cornered animal. "It is a standard joint venture agreement, brother. Clean, simple, highly lucrative. You inject the $2 million into our operating LLC, and you instantly own 40% of the highest-grossing nightclub in the state." I did not touch the pen. Instead, I slowly opened the leather folder, my eyes scanning the dense blocks of text. I flipped past the executive summary, bypassing the hollow promises of shared revenue, and went straight to the core operating clauses. The silence in the booth grew heavy, competing against the vibrating bass from the floor below. I let the tension stretch, turning a page with deliberate, agonizing slowness. Standard joint venture. I repeated, my voice dropping to a glacial analytical register that cut effortlessly through the ambient noise. That is a fascinating categorization for a document that is fundamentally designed to execute a fraudulent transfer of senior secured debt. Jamal's confident smile fractured instantly. His hand reaching for his champagne glass stopped dead in midair. Chloe's fake crying abruptly ceased, her eyes darting between me and her husband in genuine confusion. I have built my entire career dissecting complex corporate architecture, Jamal, I said, leaning forward and tapping my index finger against the specific page. Let us examine your craftsmanship. Section 4, subparagraph C, the Capital Contribution Clause. You have explicitly classified my $2 million injection as a non-refundable equity buy-in rather than a secured amortized loan. In a vacuum, that might just seem like aggressive negotiating. But when you pair it with the indemnification rider buried on page 17, the architecture becomes entirely predatory. Jamal swallowed hard, a thick bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead. Isaiah Mann, that is just standard legal boilerplate. My attorneys insisted on it to protect the corporate veil. You do not have attorneys, Jamal, I replied coldly. You have a downloaded template and a desperate failing strategy. Page 17 legally binds the incoming minority equity partner, which would be me, to a full assumption of all existing corporate liabilities prior to the date of execution. You are not offering me a percentage of future revenue. You are legally attempting to transfer your crushing, unpayable debt load directly onto my personal balance sheet. If I sign this, I trigger a blanket UCC-1 filing that grants your creditors immediate claim against my personal assets. I flipped back to the first page, my eyes locking onto his terrified stare. If I sign this paper, I am legally agreeing to absorb the 3 merchant cash advances currently bleeding your operational accounts dry. I am agreeing to assume the mezzanine debt you defaulted on last month. I am voluntarily stepping in front of the executioner to take the hit for your impending Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This is not a bridge loan, Jamal. This is a financial suicide pact wrapped in velvet and cheap champagne. The absolute panic radiating from him was palpable. He looked as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the VIP booth. His chest heaved and he looked frantically at Chloe for support, but she was completely paralyzed. Furthermore, I continued, twisting the knife with surgical precision. Your subordination agreement actively strips the new equity partner of any voting rights or operational oversight. I would be legally responsible for paying the millions you owe to your shadow creditors, but I would not possess the legal authority to fire you, restructure the club, or liquidate the physical assets. You drafted a toxic liability transfer disguised as an equity partnership. You designed this trap to extract my verified liquid capital to satisfy your aggressive lenders, completely shielding yourself from personal ruin while leaving me to drown in your manufactured disaster. I picked up the document and held it inches from his face. Did you honestly believe a venture capitalist would overlook a cross-default provision linked to a highly leveraged operating agreement? You are carrying 90 days of rent arrears on a triple-net commercial lease. The default interest rate compounding on your unpaid invoices is suffocating your daily cash flow. You are facing imminent structural collapse. You think I do not know why you need exactly $2 million? It is not to renovate the VIP lounge. It is because Southern Spirits filed an $85,000 lien, your payroll account is overdrawn, and your primary commercial lender is moving to freeze your operating capital. But the real urgency, the reason you are sweating through your velvet jacket, is because Pastor Calvin and Patricia leveraged the church's deed to provide you with a shadow loan, and that 14% balloon payment is due. You need my capital to save their property. You are trying to steal my money to save the fraudulent empire your in-laws built, effectively using my cash to bail out the very people who abandoned me. You mapped out a complete structural transfer of your failures onto my ledger. You thought you could blind me with familial guilt, utilizing my sister's tears as a smokescreen, while you quietly shifted your impending legal and financial destruction onto my shoulders. The breakdown was absolute. I had systematically stripped away every layer of their pathetic illusion, exposing the raw, rotting core of their greed. Jamal was physically trembling now, the reality of his failure crashing down on him. He had brought a plastic knife to a gunfight against a financial warlord, Isaiah. Chloe stammered, her voice stripped of its practiced melody, replaced by raw, unvarnished fear. "We did not mean to trap you. We just needed help. The family needs help. If we lose the club, Mom and Dad lose the church. We will lose everything. We will be completely ruined." And right there in the midst of their absolute devastation, I shifted my demeanor completely. I let my cold, analytical stare soften. I leaned back into the plush leather seating, exhaling a long, heavy breath, as if the weight of familial duty was suddenly pulling at my conscience. I looked at Chloe, allowing a flicker of manufactured empathy to cross my face. "I know," I said softly, my tone shifting from corporate predator to protective brother. "I know exactly what is at stake. I know the position Calvin and Patricia put you in. I know you are terrified." Chloe's eyes widened, a desperate, confused hope flaring in her chest. She genuinely believed my sudden display of vulnerability. She thought her emotional manipulation was actually working. That blood loyalty was overriding my financial common sense. "I am not going to let the family fall into ruin," I said, my voice rich with false reassurance. "I will provide the $2 million to clear your immediate debts." Jamal let out a breathless, suffocating gasp of relief, practically collapsing against the back of his chair. He wiped his sweating face, nodding furiously. "Thank you, brother. I swear we will make this right." I picked up the heavy Mont Blanc pen from the glass table. At that exact moment, Xavier stepped smoothly out of the shadows behind me. With a fluid, practiced sleight of hand, he slid a thin, pristine leather folder directly over Jamal's fraudulent contract, opening it flat before me. "Sign here to authorize the capital release." "Sir," Xavier stated, his voice perfectly monotone. Jamal and Chloe were so blinded by their sudden miraculous salvation that they did not even bother to look at the new document. They did not notice the official seal of the Atlanta Commercial Real Estate Registry stamped at the top of the page. They were completely consumed by the illusion of victory. I smiled, looking Jamal dead in the eye as I brought the pen to the paper. I did not sign an equity partnership. I did not sign a bridge loan. With a swift, merciless stroke of ink, I signed the final expedited commercial transfer papers, legally finalizing my total acquisition of the building's deed. I was now his landlord, and his eviction notice was already printing. The transition from the suffocating bass-heavy atmosphere of the Onyx Room to the absolute silence of my downtown penthouse felt like stepping onto another planet. It was 2 a.m. The sprawling Atlanta skyline glowed beneath my floor-to-ceiling smart glass windows, a vast grid of amber and white lights stretching out into the dark horizon. My office was a fortress of isolation, designed for absolute clarity and high-level execution. The air conditioning hummed softly, a steady, rhythmic white noise that usually helped me center my thoughts after a corporate kill. I stood by the glass, looking down at the city, my hands clasped loosely behind my back. The ink on the commercial transfer papers was dry. Jamal Davenport was officially a tenant in a building he did not know I owned, bleeding out from a financial wound he had inflicted upon himself. The first phase of the operation was flawlessly complete. The heavy biometric lock on my office door clicked open. Xavier stepped into the room, bypassing his usual measured stride. He moved with an uncharacteristic, rigid urgency. He carried a heavy, reinforced steel lockbox in his left hand and a secure, encrypted tablet in his right. He did not offer his standard greeting. He walked directly to the holographic display table, placing the steel box down with a dull, heavy thud that reverberated through the quiet room. Isaiah Xavier began, his voice lacking its usual polished corporate detachment. He sounded genuinely disturbed, a rare tone for a man who dismantled Fortune 500 companies for a living. Our private investigators finalized the deep dive into the shadow banking ledgers. They initiated a secondary forensic sweep of the Sterling family's historical offshore routing numbers. We uncovered a secondary network of credit lines that were deliberately hidden from standard audits. Xavier tapped the tablet, instantly linking it to the primary display table. 4 distinct digital dossiers materialized in the air between us. The raw data has been compiled and secured. Xavier continued, his eyes remaining fixed on the glowing screens. You can review the unredacted evidence files directly on the server. They are securely cataloged. Refer to them by their exact designations. There is a file you can reference named A1_12.docx. There is a file you can reference named A2_13.docx. There is a file you can reference named A3_12.docs. There is a file you can reference named A4_12.docx. I strongly suggest you review the origination documents inside those files immediately. I approached the table, my expression completely neutral. I opened the first digital file. A scanned application for a high-yield unsecured commercial line of credit filled the screen. I looked at the primary applicant's name. I looked at the social security number attached to the application. I looked at the origination date. It was my name. It was my social security number. The date of origination was exactly 6 months after they had abandoned me at the Greyhound bus station. Open the master ledger, I instructed, my voice perfectly level. Xavier swiped his hand across the screen, expanding a massive interconnected web of financial transactions spanning 23 years. They did not just abandon you, Xavier said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. They actively monetized your absence. For 2 decades, Calvin and Patricia Sterling utilized your stolen social security number to open dozens of fraudulent credit lines, synthetic corporate identities, and high-limit luxury retail accounts. They routed the debt through an elaborate series of shell companies to avoid defaulting their own pristine credit scores. The total principal amount stolen under your identity is $850,000. I remained completely still. I did not scream. I did not slam my fists against the glass table. I did not reach for the crystal bourbon decanter to hurl it against the wall. Instead, a terrifying absolute calm washed over my entire body. My heart rate actually slowed down. My breathing became shallow, measured, and perfectly controlled. I simply stood there, bathing in the blue light of the digital displays, staring at the meticulous 23-year record of my family's ultimate sin. The silence in the penthouse stretched out, expanding, until it felt heavy enough to crush bone. Xavier watched me closely, his posture tense, anticipating a violent explosion of rage that would never come. Emotion was a severe liability, a luxury reserved for people who had not been forged in absolute trauma. I pushed the anger down into a dark, locked vault in my mind, allowing pure, cold logic to take the wheel. I raised my hand and slowly scrolled through the transaction history, dissecting the items bought with my stolen identity. I looked at a charge from 18 years ago, $4,000 at Cartier. I remembered being 14 years old, sleeping on a thin, soiled mattress in a state-run youth shelter in South Chicago. I remembered the biting cold leaking through the poorly insulated windows, wearing sneakers 2 sizes too small because the state underfunded the wardrobe voucher. I remembered my toes curling in pain every time I walked. At that exact moment in time, my mother was using my stolen identity to purchase solid gold bangles for Chloe. I scrolled further. A charge for $12,000, fractional private jet hours leased through a premium aviation service. I was 17. I was working a brutal graveyard shift, washing dishes at a diner, rationing a single loaf of cheap white bread over 4 days. I remembered drinking warm tap water until my stomach distended just to kill the violent, gnawing hunger pangs that kept me awake at night. While I was starving in the dark, desperate to survive the week, Calvin Sterling was signing my name on a luxury aviation manifest to fly his fraudulent ministry team to a private resort in the Bahamas. They had actively tethered me to their greed. The $10 bill at the bus station was not the last thing they gave me. They had given me a lifetime of invisible, crushing debt, bleeding a ghost dry to fund their vanity. They had taken a discarded, unwanted child and transformed his social security number into an endless ATM. Every luxury car lease, every emerald silk dress, Every ounce of performative wealth that Chloe flaunted at the dinner table was financed by the systematic financial rape of an abandoned boy. The sheer calculated sociopathy of it was almost beautiful in its darkness. They did not just fail as parents, they functioned as highly organized financial predators. They had built their holy empire on the back of my stolen identity, confident that the disposable child they threw to the wolves would simply vanish, die, or end up incarcerated, completely incapable of ever unearthing their massive fraud. I leaned forward, resting my palms flat against the cold surface of the glass table. I stared at the signature on the original credit application. Calvin's handwriting. Bold, arrogant, unquestionable. "They are living on my blood," I whispered into the quiet room. The sound of my own voice was devoid of any humanity. It was the sound of a machine executing a lethal algorithm. Xavier stepped closer, recognizing the dangerous shift in my demeanor. "Isaiah, this instantly elevates our strategy. We are no longer dealing with simple civil litigation, predatory lending, or hostile commercial takeovers. This is a massive, multi-jurisdictional federal crime. We have incontrovertible proof of aggravated identity theft, federal wire fraud, and systemic bank fraud spanning 2 decades. The statute of limitations on the bank fraud alone allows for federal prosecution. If we hand these dossiers over to the United States Attorney's Office, the Department of Justice will launch a RICO investigation. Calvin and Patricia will face a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary." I continued to stare at the screen, analyzing the exact trajectory of their destruction. The corporate raiding, the shadow debt acquisition, the seizing of Jamal's nightclub lease that was merely financial warfare. That was simply balancing the ledger. But this was the weapon of mass destruction. This was the nuclear option. I slowly straightened my posture, adjusting my suit jacket. The coldness inside me solidified into an unbreakable diamond. I had originally planned to financially ruin them, to strip them of their wealth, and watch them crawl back into the obscurity they deserved. But federal financial crimes required a different theater of execution. I wanted the congregation to see the monster hiding behind the pulpit. I wanted the elite socialites of Atlanta to watch the Sterling family get dragged out of their Buckhead mansion in handcuffs. "Lock down the digital dossiers," I instructed Xavier, my voice sharp and commanding. "Consolidate every piece of evidence, every forged signature, every fraudulent wire transfer. Create a comprehensive, watertight prosecution package, but do not send it to the federal authorities yet." Xavier frowned, confused by the delay. "Why wait? We have the kill shot right here." "Because dropping this evidence to a federal prosecutor in the middle of the night is too quiet," I replied, walking back over to the expansive windows and looking down at the sleeping city. "It is too sterile. Calvin and Patricia thrive on public spectacle. They worship optics. They built their entire kingdom on the adoration of the crowd. To truly destroy them, we must execute them on their own stage in front of the very people they manipulated." I turned back to Xavier, my eyes devoid of any mercy. "Tomorrow is Sunday. Calvin is delivering the keynote sermon for his highly anticipated Youth Annex expansion project. The entire congregation will be there. The local media will be there. Jamal and Chloe will be sitting in the front row, fully expecting me to wire $2 million to save their club. They believe I am their ultimate savior." I walked back to the desk, picking up my phone. "I want you to coordinate with our private security firm. Prepare a secure courier to deliver these 4 specific documents directly to the United States Attorney's Office tomorrow morning, but hold the physical delivery until I give the command. And Xavier, yes, Isaiah, draft a formal, legally binding confession regarding the identity theft and the 23 years of fraud. Make sure the language is completely indisputable. Print it on heavy ivory paper." I looked back at the glowing red numbers on the holographic display, the staggering $850,000 stolen from a starving child to fund a kingdom of lies. "Tomorrow morning," I said softly, the words hanging in the cold air. "I am going to church." Xavier nodded, his fingers flying across the encrypted tablet to execute my final commands. The server hummed quietly in the background, processing the staggering amount of data we had just uncovered. But as he initiated the lockdown protocols on the digital dossiers, he paused, looking up at me with a rare expression of professional disagreement. "You understand the risk you are taking by delaying the federal authorities?" Isaiah's Xavier stated, his voice flat and analytical. If we alert the FBI tonight, they raid the Buckhead mansion before dawn. Calvin and Patricia wake up to federal agents breaking down their custom mahogany doors. They are perp walked out in their pajamas in front of the local news crews. It is clean. It is absolute. It is legally bulletproof. I turned away from the floor-to-ceiling windows and walked back to the holographic display table. Arresting them is too easy, Xavier. I spoke the words with a chilling, detached precision. If the federal authorities take them tonight, they instantly become victims of the justice system. Calvin will hire a high-profile defense attorney. He will claim persecution. He will stand in front of a judge and spin a masterful narrative about a misunderstood clerical error or a rogue accountant. His congregation will rally behind him. They will set up legal defense funds. They will turn him into a martyr. I refuse to give him the luxury of a microphone. Xavier watched me closely, understanding the absolute finality in my tone. You want to execute a total systemic annihilation? I want them to feel the exact same terror I felt when I was 14 years old, standing on the curb at the Greyhound station with $10 in my pocket. I replied, my eyes scanning the glowing red numbers of my stolen identity. I want them to wake up in a world where the ground has completely vanished beneath their feet. I want them to reach for their power, their money, their influence, and find absolutely nothing but empty air. We are not just going to report them to the authorities. We are going to sever their life support systems simultaneously. When the federal agents finally arrive, there will be nothing left for them to salvage. I place my hands flat on the digital table, bringing up the broader schematic of the Sterling family asset portfolio. The financial architecture of their empire was built on leveraged debt and the blind faith of their creditors. It was a house of cards, and I was about to remove the bottom layer. We begin with the primary residence, I instructed, highlighting a specific data node on the table. The Buckhead Mansion. Xavier pulled up the property records. The mansion is currently mortgaged through Southern Heritage Trust, a boutique regional bank catering to high-net-worth clients in the Atlanta area. The Sterlings hold a primary mortgage of $3.2 million, plus a secondary home equity line of credit that they have completely maxed out. Southern Heritage Trust is a small player I analyzed rapidly, calculating the bank's liquidity ratios based on public financial disclosures. They are heavily over-leveraged in commercial real estate and currently facing regulatory pressure to clean up their distressed asset portfolios. They cannot afford to carry high-risk liabilities. We are going to buy the bank. Xavier raised an eyebrow, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his stoic features. A hostile takeover of a regional bank overnight. Not the entire institution, I clarified, tapping the screen to initiate a secure connection to my primary offshore holding company. Just their distressed mortgage division. Southern Heritage has bundled a specific portfolio of high-risk luxury mortgages to sell off to private equity firms. The Sterling Mansion is sitting right in the middle of that toxic bundle. I authorized a massive, aggressive transfer of liquid capital from my primary accounts. I instructed Xavier to route the funds through 3 separate shell corporations to mask the origin of the purchase. We contacted the emergency after hours broker for Southern Heritage Trust. For a boutique bank struggling with liquidity, an anonymous buyer offering a premium cash buyout for their most toxic debt bundle in the middle of the night was an absolute godsend. They did not ask questions. They drafted the digital transfer agreements within 20 minutes. I watched the progress bar on the holographic display fill with bright green light. The transaction cleared. The electronic deed transfer registered in the secure county database. I now legally hold the primary mortgage on the Buckhead Mansion. I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet penthouse. I hold the note. I hold the equity line. Because they missed their last 2 payments, I have the legal authority to call the entire loan due immediately. They have exactly 0 days to cure the default. They do not own that house anymore. I do. Xavier updated the master ledger, placing a bright red lock icon over the digital representation of the Sterling Mansion. Next, he brought up the extensive network of fraudulent credit lines Calvin and Patricia had opened using my stolen Social Security number. This requires a delicate approach, Xavier noted, scrolling through the massive list of active accounts. If we simply freeze these lines, the banks will automatically notify the primary cardholders. Calvin and Patricia will receive text alerts on their phones immediately. It will tip them off before the church service. We do not freeze them from the outside. I countered, a cold, predatory smile touching the corners of my mouth. We weaponize the fraud against them. Since these accounts were opened using my legal identity, I am technically the primary account holder. I have the absolute legal authority to report these specific cards as stolen. I authorized Xavier to initiate automated fraud protocols directly with the major credit bureaus. We did not flag the accounts for minor suspicious activity. We triggered a catastrophic systemic identity theft lockdown. Because my stolen Social Security number was intimately linked to Calvin and Patricia's legitimate banking profiles through years of cross-collateralization and shared addresses, the fraud alerts immediately bled over into their personal accounts. Within 60 seconds, the algorithms at Visa, MasterCard, and American Express flagged every single piece of plastic the Sterling family possessed. Xavier watched the cascading alerts light up the display screen. "It is done," he confirmed, his voice laced with dark satisfaction. "Every credit card, every debit card, every corporate expense account tied to the Sterling family name has been aggressively frozen due to suspected severe federal identity theft. If Chloe tries to buy a cup of coffee tomorrow morning, her card will decline. If Patricia tries to pay the private chef, the transaction will hard bounce. They have absolutely zero liquidity. They cannot access a single dollar." I continued the systematic strangulation. I targeted the fractional private jet membership my father used to fly his ministry team around the country. By utilizing my newly acquired status as the primary creditor of the Greater Light megachurch, I officially revoked the corporate authorization for the aviation account, canceling all scheduled flights and locking the hangar access codes. My father was permanently grounded. I turned my attention back to Jamal and Chloe. We had already secured the commercial deed to the Onyx Room, but Jamal still controlled the operational bank accounts. He was expecting a $2 million wire transfer to clear by Monday morning. I instructed Xavier to issue a formal, legally binding stop payment order on the fraudulent joint venture agreement Jamal had practically begged me to sign. I then drafted an official landlord notice of immediate eviction citing gross violation of the commercial lease terms and severe property neglect. I scheduled the eviction notice to be delivered directly to the club's front doors by a private security team exactly at noon on Sunday. Jamal and Chloe would wake up believing they were millionaires. By lunchtime, they would be locked out of their own buildings staring at a notice of total default. The digital map of Atlanta glowing on the holographic table was now covered entirely in red markers. Every asset, every property, every bank account, and every credit line belonging to the Sterling family had been systematically compromised, locked down, or completely acquired. I had built a flawless, inescapable financial guillotine, and I had positioned their necks perfectly beneath the blade. I stepped back from the table, looking out at the city skyline. The deep, pitch-black darkness of the night was slowly beginning to crack. A faint, bruised line of purple and gray light was forming on the eastern horizon. Dawn was approaching. The city of Atlanta was about to wake up completely unaware of the silent massacre that had just occurred in the digital ether above their heads. Xavier powered down the primary servers, securing the prosecution packages and the printed confession document in his leather briefcase. "The preparation is complete, Isaiah. The trap is fully set. There is no mathematical or legal loophole available to them. They are completely isolated." I remained silent, watching the sun slowly climb above the skyscrapers, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete canyons below. For 23 years, I had carried the crushing weight of their rejection. I had survived in the shadows, fighting for scraps, building my empire on pure, unadulterated rage, while they paraded in the sunlight, wearing clothes bought with my stolen name. They had preached about salvation while actively crucifying their own son for profit. I walked over to the mahogany wardrobe in the corner of my office. I opened the heavy doors and reached for a meticulously tailored charcoal gray suit. I selected a crisp, brilliant white shirt and a dark, muted tie. I dressed with slow, deliberate precision, treating the garments like a suit of armor. I fastened a heavy platinum watch around my wrist, checking the time. It was 6 in the morning. The time for planning was officially over. The time for execution had finally arrived. I adjusted my cuffs, staring at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. The boy who had cried at the Greyhound station was dead. The man looking back at me was a force of absolute reckoning. "Bring the car around to the private garage, Xavier," I commanded, my voice devoid of any warmth, any hesitation, or any mercy. I turned away from the window and picked up the thick ivory envelope containing the printed confession and the federal evidence dossiers. It is time to go to church, the greater light. Megachurch was not a place of worship. It was a sprawling $50 million monument to my father's unchecked ego and insatiable greed. The architecture resembled a modern high-tech sports arena rather than a sanctuary. It featured a massive soaring glass atrium, cascading indoor water features, and a sprawling VIP parking lot currently packed with luxury European imports. As Xavier navigated my armored Maybach through the restricted pastoral entrance, the sheer scale of the operation settled over me. 5,000 congregants were already packed tightly into the stadium seating. High-definition broadcast cameras mounted on motorized jibs swept across the massive auditorium, live-streaming the morning spectacle to hundreds of thousands of devoted viewers across the globe. Local politicians, city council members, and wealthy Atlanta real estate developers occupied the reserved platinum seating in the first 3 rows. They were all there to pay tribute to Pastor Calvin Sterling, completely blind to the fact that his entire empire was currently resting on a tripwire I had already pulled. Xavier parked the vehicle near the private green room entrance. I stepped out into the crisp Sunday morning air, smoothly adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit. Xavier fell in step directly behind my right shoulder, carrying the slim leather briefcase that contained the absolute documented destruction of the Sterling family. We bypassed the standard security checkpoints without a word, the senior ushers recognizing my face from the charity gala the previous night, and assuming I was the newly returned prodigal billionaire, practically bowed as they opened the heavy mahogany doors leading directly into the main sanctuary. The wall of sound hit me instantly. A massive 12-piece contemporary gospel band was concluding their opening set, the heavy bass reverberating violently through the floorboards. The lighting shifted dynamically, cutting the bright house lights and replacing them with a dramatic single spotlight, illuminating the center of the sprawling acrylic stage. Calvin Sterling stepped confidently into the light. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue suit that I knew for an absolute fact was purchased using a credit card opened under my stolen Social Security number. He held a leather-bound Bible in one hand and a wireless microphone in the other. He looked powerful, untouchable, and completely in his element. I stood completely still in the shadows at the very back of the auditorium, remaining entirely out of sight as I surveyed the psychological trap my father was setting. Patricia sat in the dead center of the front row, wearing a dazzling white designer dress, her hands clasped together in an attitude of perfect pious devotion. 2 seats down, Chloe and Jamal sat shoulder to shoulder. Jamal was practically vibrating with smug, arrogant energy, wearing a fresh silk tie, completely convinced that my $2 million wire transfer was currently clearing into his commercial bank account. They all looked so secure, so comfortably insulated by their stolen wealth and the blind adoration of the 5,000 people sitting behind them. Calvin raised his hand and the band immediately cut the music. A breathless, expectant silence fell over the massive room. He bowed his head for a long theatrical moment before looking up at the crowd, his eyes shining with practiced manufactured emotion. "Brothers and sisters," Calvin bellowed, his rich baritone voice echoing flawlessly through the state-of-the-art acoustic system. "Today is not a standard Sunday. Today is a day of absolute undeniable miracles. Today we are witnessing the physical manifestation of God's restorative grace right here in our sanctuary. For years, I have stood behind this pulpit and preached about the parable of the prodigal son. I have spoken to you about the deep, lingering pain of a father waiting on the porch, staring at the horizon, praying every single night for his lost boy to return home. The congregation murmured in loud agreement, a wave of sympathetic amens rippling through the crowd. My mother reached up and dabbed at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, performing her role as the long-suffering, heartbroken matriarch flawlessly for the cameras. I know that pain, Calvin continued, his voice dropping an octave, cracking with fake, calculated vulnerability. I know the sleepless nights. I know the sheer agony of a fractured family. But I also know the glory of restoration. Yesterday, after years of painful separation, my eldest son Isaiah returned to this family. He returned not just with a contrite heart, but with a spirit of immense, overwhelming generosity. I remained perfectly still in the shadows, my face a mask of cold granite. He was masterfully setting the narrative. He was using the live broadcast and the 5,000 witnesses to socially and psychologically corner me. He was deliberately framing my return as an act of submission, preparing to publicly lock me into funding his sinking ship. If I walked away or refused his demands after this highly public spectacle, I would look like the bitter, unforgiving villain, and he would remain the righteous, forgiving father. It was a brilliant, highly manipulative trap. But restoration is about moving forward. Calvin preached, his energy rising rapidly, pacing across the wide acrylic stage. It is about building the future. And the future of the Greater Light megachurch rests on strong, dedicated, unshakable leadership. That is why today, before we celebrate the return of one son, I must honor the unwavering loyalty of another. Calvin gestured broadly toward the front row. Jamal, my son-in-law, my right hand, please come join me on this stage. The congregation erupted into deafening applause. Jamal stood up, shooting a triumphant, arrogant look toward Chloe before jogging eagerly up the carpeted stairs to the stage. He embraced my father, playing the role of the humble, dedicated servant perfectly for the audience. Jamal has stood by this ministry through every trial, Calvin announced, placing a heavy paternal hand on Jamal's shoulder. He has been the absolute bedrock of this family. And today, I am officially ordaining Jamal Davenport as a senior elder of this church. Furthermore, he will be taking over as the primary director of the new multi-million-dollar Youth Annex expansion project. More applause washed over the room. Jamal bowed his head, soaking in the unearned validation. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. Jamal was 90 days delinquent on his commercial lease, drowning in predatory loans and facing imminent eviction from a building I now owned, yet my father was publicly handing him the keys to a church expansion. It was a blind, desperate attempt to legitimize Jamal before my capital officially entered their accounts. Calvin raised his hand again, silencing the crowd. He turned his gaze away from Jamal, scanning the massive auditorium. The camera operators on the motorized jibs anticipated the cue, swinging their heavy lenses around to search the crowd. "But we cannot build this future alone," Calvin proclaimed, his voice booming with undeniable, forceful power. "The Youth Annex requires massive financial backing. It requires vision. It requires a champion. And God has delivered that champion right back to our doorstep. My son Isaiah Sterling has returned to us as a giant in the financial world. He has returned to invest not just in his family, but in the kingdom of heaven. He has pledged a massive, unprecedented financial contribution to secure the legacy of this church and to completely fund the new youth annex." The crowd gasped collectively before erupting into a deafening standing ovation. The sheer pressure of 5,000 people cheering for a donation I had never agreed to make was suffocating. My mother stood up, raising her hands to the ceiling, weeping actual performative tears of joy for the live stream. Chloe was clapping furiously, her eyes scanning the aisles, eagerly looking for the man who was about to pay off all her husband's toxic debts. Isaiah Calvin called out, his voice echoing over the thunderous applause, a triumphant smile plastered across his face. "My son, come down to the front, come up to this stage. Let your family welcome you home. Let this congregation see the man who is securing our beautiful future." I stepped out of the shadows at the back of the auditorium. The usher standing nearest to me immediately pointed, and the primary broadcast camera swung sharply, locking its red tally light directly onto my face. My image was instantly projected onto the two massive digital screens flanking the pulpit. The applause grew louder, a roaring physical force vibrating through the floorboards. I did not smile. I did not wave. I did not acknowledge the cheering crowd in any capacity. I simply began walking down the center aisle. My pace was slow, measured, and terrifyingly calm. I looked entirely out of place in this cathedral of false emotion. I was wearing a bespoke, dark charcoal suit that screamed Wall Street predator, not prodigal son. Xavier walked exactly 2 paces behind my right shoulder, his face a mask of absolute icy detachment, holding the leather briefcase tightly against his side. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Calvin. As I walked closer, the distance shrinking with every measured step, I watched the subtle creeping changes in his expression. The triumphant, booming smile playing across his lips began to falter. The sheer, unyielding coldness radiating from my eyes was not the look of a contrite son seeking validation. It was the look of an executioner stepping onto the scaffold. I reached the front of the auditorium. Patricia took a step toward the aisle, throwing her arms open wide, ready to embrace me for the cameras. I did not even break my stride. I walked straight past her extended arms, leaving her standing awkwardly in the aisle, her fake smile freezing on her face. Chloe's clapping slowed and then stopped completely as I passed her row. The arrogant gleam in Jamal's eyes vanished, replaced by a sudden creeping confusion. I climbed the 5 carpeted steps to the main stage. The applause in the room began to sound uncertain, tapering off, as the congregation collectively sensed the severe, heavy tension radiating from the pulpit. Calvin stood his ground, holding the wireless microphone out toward me. He was trying to maintain control of the narrative, desperately attempting to force me into the script he had written. "Welcome home, son Calvin," said his voice carrying over the speakers, though it lacked the booming confidence from moments before. "Tell this congregation what God has put on your heart today." I did not take the microphone from his outstretched hand. Instead, I reached over to the acrylic podium and pulled the secondary wired microphone from its stand. I held it in my left hand, turning my back entirely to my father and Jamal. I faced the 5,000 people staring up at me. I looked at the red light of the primary broadcast camera, knowing that hundreds of thousands of people were watching this live feed. The auditorium fell into an absolute suffocating silence. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. You could hear the soft whir of the camera motors. The air in the room thickened, growing heavy, and charged with an electric, dangerous anticipation. I let the silence stretch. I let the severe discomfort settle deep into the bones of every single person in the room. Xavier stepped up beside me, resting the leather briefcase flat on the clear acrylic podium. He unclasped the brass locks with 2 sharp, echoing clicks that sounded exactly like gunshots in the quiet church. I raised the microphone to my mouth. My voice was soft, barely above a conversational murmur, yet it echoed with absolute, terrifying clarity through the $50 million sound system. I did not shout. I did not perform. I simply spoke with the cold mechanical precision of a blade dropping. "Good morning." I began, letting the greeting wash over the sea of 5,000 faces staring up at me. Pastor Calvin speaks eloquently of prodigal sons and joyous restoration. He speaks of immense generosity, of building a beautiful future on a foundation of family and faith. It is a highly compelling narrative. It is a story expertly designed to move hearts and, more importantly, to open wallets. But a true foundation cannot be built on a deliberate illusion. Before I stepped out of the shadows this morning, I had my chief operating officer pay a visit to your production booth. The technicians were remarkably cooperative when presented with the proper, highly lucrative incentives. You see, absolute transparency is the fundamental cornerstone of any legitimate financial partnership. If I am to be publicly pressured into investing my capital into this family, this congregation deserves to see exactly what kind of empire we are currently building. I gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Xavier. He tapped a single command on his encrypted tablet. Behind me, the massive 40-foot LED screens that had been projecting my father's gleaming ministry logo suddenly flickered. The stylized crosses and soaring doves vanished instantly. In their place, a stark, high-resolution scan of a legal document illuminated the auditorium in harsh black and white text. At the very top, printed in bold, undeniable lettering, was a commercial notice of total default and immediate eviction. I turned slowly away from the stunned congregation and faced Jamal. He was standing just a few feet away, his pristine velvet jacket suddenly looking incredibly heavy and restrictive. The smug, anointed glow had completely evaporated from his face, replaced by a sickly pale sheen. He stared at the massive screen behind me, his mouth opening and closing in silent, suffocating panic. "Brother Jamal," I said, my voice cutting through the dead silence of the sanctuary like a scalpel. "I cannot fund your youth annex. I cannot fund your ministry. Because as of 8 o'clock this morning, your club legally belongs to me. You are bankrupt." A collective, visceral gasp ripped through the massive room. 5,000 people inhaled sharply, a sound like a sudden, violent rush of wind. In the front row, Chloe dropped her designer handbag. It hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud. She stared up at the stage, her perfectly applied makeup unable to mask the pure, unadulterated horror fracturing her features. Jamal took a physical step backward, stumbling clumsily against the acrylic podium. "Isaiah," he stammered, his microphone picking up his terrified, breathy whisper. "What are you doing? We had an agreement. We signed the papers last night." "We did not sign a joint venture, Jamal." I took a deliberate step toward him, closing the physical distance, asserting absolute predatory dominance on his own stage. "You brought a fraudulent contract to a VIP booth, hoping to trap me into absorbing the toxic debt of a failing nightclub. You attempted to trick me into a massive liability transfer because you are exactly 90 days delinquent on a triple net commercial lease. You owe $85,000 to Southern Spirits for unpaid inventory. Your payroll accounts are severely overdrawn, and your primary commercial lender is moving to freeze your operational capital. You are bleeding out from 1,000 self-inflicted financial wounds." I kept my eyes locked onto his, refusing to let him look away from his own destruction. "You stand on this holy stage wearing a $5,000 suit, eagerly accepting the applause of these good people, accepting the revered title of a church elder, while your entire existence is a fragile house of cards financed by predatory shadow loans. You sold my sister an illusion of untouchable Atlanta elite status. You leased luxury cars you absolutely cannot afford. You bought counterfeit vintage champagne to pour into crystal glasses while your creditors prepared to rip the doors off your establishment. You genuinely thought you were outsmarting a venture capitalist. You thought your cheap, downloaded legal template was a masterpiece of corporate deception. But while you were admiring your fake contract, I reached out directly to your landlords. They were desperate to offload a severely delinquent tenant. I purchased the deed to your commercial building entirely in cash, closing the deal at the middle of the night. I did not sign an equity partnership last night, Jamal. I signed the final transfer papers acquiring your lease. I own the walls of the Onyx Room. I own the floors. I own the very doors that are currently being chained shut by my private security team. You have been officially evicted. You are standing on this stage without a single asset to your name." I turned my body slightly, addressing the breathless congregation, while keeping my focus tethered to Jamal's sweating, trembling face. "Let us talk about the math, Jamal, because math is the only absolute truth I respect. You promised me 40% of the highest-grossing nightclub in the state, but the Onyx Room has not turned a legitimate profit in 14 months. Your overhead is bloated by exorbitant personal expenses you illegally wrote off as business costs. The designer bags for your wife, the luxury vacations you took while your staff went unpaid, the private VIP tables you comped for local influencers just to maintain your fragile social standing. You funded a lifestyle of absolute excess, using mezzanine debt, carrying a 22% interest rate. It is a mathematical impossibility to survive that kind of reckless leverage. You thought you were a mastermind. You sat in that glass booth last night, sweating through your designer cologne, sliding a fraudulent operating agreement across the table, genuinely believing you had secured your salvation. You thought your little fine print liability transfer would magically absolve you of your responsibilities. But all you did was hand me the precise blueprint to your total destruction. I did not just buy the building to evict you. I systematically purchased your debt. I hold the promissory notes for the merchant cash advances you defaulted on. I am now your primary senior creditor. I turned fully to the congregation, my voice projecting with cold, unyielding authority. This man stood before you moments ago, eagerly accepting the mantle of leadership for a multi-million-dollar youth expansion project. He accepted your applause. He accepted your blind trust. How can a man who cannot mathematically sustain a single commercial lease be entrusted with the financial future of your children? How can a man who actively attempts to defraud his own brother-in-law be trusted to manage the tithes and offerings of this congregation? He is a financial predator masquerading as a pillar of this community. I turned back to Jamal, whose knees were visibly shaking beneath his tailored trousers. His jaw worked silently, trying desperately to form words to mount a defense, but his vocal cords refused to cooperate. The utter humiliation of being stripped naked in front of the very people he sought to impress was breaking his mind in real time. You wanted a massive public announcement of my contribution, Jamal. You wanted the broadcast cameras rolling. You wanted the whole city to see our partnership. Well, they are watching. They are watching you realize that you have lost absolutely everything. Your club is shuttered. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your credit lines are locked down due to severe default protocols I initiated hours ago. You cannot access a single dollar. You cannot even buy a tank of gas to drive home. You are not a church elder, Jamal. You are a desperate grifter who finally ran out of marks. You ran out of credit, you ran out of time, and you made the fatal, irreversible miscalculation of trying to mark me. Your business is gone. Your social currency is gone. The velvet ropes and the VIP illusion have been entirely stripped away. You are bankrupt in every conceivable sense of the word. Jamal's legs finally gave out. He stumbled backward, his hands grasping blindly at the clear acrylic podium to keep himself from collapsing onto the carpeted stage. He looked frantically toward Calvin, his eyes wide and pleading for the pastor to intervene, to stop the public slaughter, to save him from the financial guillotine. But Calvin was frozen. The powerful, booming pastor was completely paralyzed, his grip white-knuckled on the edge of his Bible, his mind frantically trying to process how rapidly his masterful public relations stunt had transformed into a televised execution. The silence in the megachurch was deafening. 5,000 people were collectively holding their breath, paralyzed by the sheer, unvarnished brutality of the truth. The high-definition cameras on their motorized jibs remained locked on the stage, broadcasting Jamal's total ruin to the world. I stood over him, the microphone resting loosely in my hand, feeling absolutely nothing but the cold satisfaction of a balanced ledger. The first strike was complete, but the true devastation was just beginning. The shockwave holding the 5,000 congregants in silent paralysis finally shattered. A low, confused murmur began to roll through the stadium's seating, growing louder by the second. People were turning to each other, pointing at the massive LED screens, displaying Jamal's financial ruin, their faces twisting from pious adoration into bewildered alarm. Calvin took a sudden, desperate step forward. His hands raised in a placating gesture, his mouth opening to spin a counter-narrative. But before he could even project a single syllable into the microphone, a shrill, piercing scream ripped through the sanctuary. Isaiah! Chloe was moving. She practically tore herself out of the front row, her designer heels sinking into the thick carpet as she sprinted up the stairs toward the stage. Her face, usually a meticulously contoured mask of Atlanta high society perfection, was contorted into an ugly, desperate snarl. She bypassed her frozen husband entirely, charging directly at me with her hands outstretched, clawing wildly for the microphone. "Turn it off!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "Turn those screens off right now! He is lying! He is a liar!" I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply shifted my weight smoothly, pivoting my shoulder to evade her grasping hands. She stumbled her momentum, carrying her awkwardly across the acrylic stage. She caught herself on the edge of the pulpit, her chest heaving, her perfectly styled hair falling into her eyes. She grabbed Calvin's microphone from the stand, her knuckles white. "Do not listen to him!" Chloe screamed to the congregation, her voice echoing shrilly through the massive speakers. "Isaiah is sick. He has always been deeply troubled. He dropped out of our lives because he is mentally unstable. He is making these documents up because he is bitter and jealous of what we have built. Security. Get him off this stage. The crowd hesitated. The narrative of the crazy, jealous brother was an easy pill for them to swallow. It fit the prodigal son theme. It preserved their comfortable illusion. I could see the doubt creeping back into the eyes of the congregation. I looked at Chloe, watching her chest rise and fall as she desperately tried to patch the holes in her shattered reality. She was wearing a flawless cream-colored silk dress, a piece that easily retailed for $4,000. She was standing on a pulpit built by donations, defending a husband bankrupted by greed, and relying on my supposed mental instability to shield her own crimes. I raised my left hand, holding a small matte black presentation remote. "I am perfectly stable, Chloe," I said, my voice cutting through her frantic screaming like a sheet of ice. "I am simply an accountant of the truth, and the truth is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of mathematics." I clicked the remote. Behind us, the massive 40-foot LED screens flashed. The commercial eviction notice vanished. In its place, a complex, high-resolution spreadsheet materialized. It was a master bank ledger completely unredacted, featuring the official seal of the Greater Light Megachurch's internal financial trust. I turned my body, directing the congregation's attention to the glowing screens. "Let us examine stability." I continued, my voice echoing with terrifying absolute authority. "Let us examine the exact nature of what you have built." 9 months ago, this church launched a massive, aggressive fundraising campaign. It was called the Greater Light Youth Sanctuary Fund. Pastor Calvin stood on this exact stage and asked you to empty your pockets. He asked the single mothers to give a little more. He asked the elderly to dip into their fixed incomes. He promised that every single dollar would go toward building a safe state-of-the-art community center for the at-risk youth of South Atlanta. The murmurs in the crowd died down instantly. I had touched a nerve. The Youth Sanctuary Fund was a point of immense pride for the congregation. They had sacrificed for it. They had believed in it. I clicked the remote a second time. A specific transaction line on the massive screen highlighted in bright, blinding yellow. The date was explicitly visible. October 14th. On October 14th, I stated, reading the numbers with surgical precision, the Greater Light Youth Sanctuary Fund received a consolidated deposit of $215,000 from the congregation. It was a record-breaking weekend for your charity. But if you look closely at the routing numbers on the screen, you will notice something fascinating. That money did not stay in the charity account. Less than 48 hours later, exactly $145,000 was wired out of the sanctuary fund. I clicked the remote again. The screen split. The left side showed the outbound wire transfer. The right side displayed the receiving account. The money was not sent to a construction firm. I explained, pacing slowly across the stage, forcing Chloe to retreat step by step. It was not sent to an architectural firm. It was routed into an offshore LLC registered in Delaware. The name of the holding company is Sterling Grace Holdings. I stopped pacing and locked eyes with my sister. She was trembling now. The microphone in her hand hung uselessly by her side. Sterling Grace Holdings is a shell corporation, I informed the breathless auditorium. It has no employees. It provides no services. It exists entirely on paper. And the sole registered managing director of that shell corporation is Chloe Sterling Davenport. A sharp collective gasp rippled through the front rows. The local politicians and real estate developers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly realizing they were sitting in the blast radius of a massive federal felony. Liar, Chloe shrieked, though her voice lacked its previous conviction. It was a high, thin sound, cracking with absolute terror. "That is fake. You hacked the servers. You manipulated the data." I ignored her completely, aiming the remote at the screen for the final lethal strike. I clicked the button. The screen shifted once more. This time it displayed a scanned official bill of sale from a luxury automotive dealership in Buckhead, directly alongside 3 itemized receipts from a premium European designer boutique. The purchasing name on all 4 documents was Chloe Sterling Davenport. The paying account was Sterling Grace Holdings. "I want to be absolutely clear about where your youth sanctuary money went," I commanded, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving register. On October 17th, $145,000 of your charity donations were wired directly to a luxury dealership to purchase a brand new fully loaded Obsidian black Mercedes G-Wagon. The exact vehicle my sister drove to church this morning. The exact vehicle currently parked in the VIP pastoral spot outside these doors. The crowd erupted. It was no longer a murmur of confusion. It was a roar of genuine visceral outrage. I could see an elderly woman in the third row dressed in her Sunday best, covering her mouth with trembling hands. I saw a man in a worn suit stand up, pointing an angry finger toward the stage. They were doing the math. They were realizing that the money they had sacrificed from their own struggling households was currently sitting in the church parking lot wrapped in German engineering. But Chloe did not stop there. I continued speaking over the rising tide of anger in the room. Why stop at a luxury vehicle when the congregation is so eager to give? On November 2nd, another $35,000 was quietly siphoned from the youth fund. That money was used to purchase 2 custom limited edition Hermes Birkin bags. I turned slowly, looking at the designer handbag Chloe had dropped on the carpeted floor of the front row just minutes ago. The camera operator, sensing the dramatic narrative, zoomed in on the abandoned bag. The image of the ridiculously expensive leather accessory flashed onto the 40-foot screens alongside the damning receipts. "Your tithes," I said, my voice dripping with cold, absolute disgust. "Your offerings, the money you gave to save at-risk children from the streets. It is all hanging on her arm. It is parked in her driveway. She did not just steal from a bank. She stole from your faith. She embezzled from your charity to finance a performative, plastic lifestyle because she could not bear the thought of looking like a failure to her elite friends." Chloe fell to her knees. Her legs simply gave way beneath the crushing, undeniable weight of the evidence. The manic defensive rage had completely evaporated, replaced by the sheer paralyzing horror of total exposure. There was no spin. There was no public relations maneuver that could survive the exact itemized receipts of her greed projected on a 40-foot screen in front of 5,000 angry victims. She dropped the microphone. It hit the stage with a loud electronic screech that made several people in the front row cover their ears. She brought both hands up, burying her face in her palms, sobbing hysterically. But these were not the beautiful, performative tears she had shed earlier. These were the ugly, ragged, suffocating sobs of a woman watching her entire existence vaporize in seconds. The high society status she had desperately cultivated in Atlanta was dead. The country club memberships, the charity galas, the elite dinner parties, they were all gone. She was no longer the glamorous, untouchable daughter of the city's most powerful pastor. She was a petty thief, a common embezzler who stole from children to buy purses. She would be a social pariah before the church service even officially ended. The outrage in the auditorium was boiling over. People were standing up in the aisles. Ushers were scrambling, trying to maintain order, but the sheer volume of betrayal was too massive to contain. Voices were shouting, demanding answers, demanding their money back. The atmosphere had shifted from a holy gathering to a chaotic tribunal. Calvin was gripping the acrylic podium, his face drained of all color, staring at the screens in absolute shock. He knew about the shell companies. I knew he did. But seeing the exact mechanics of his daughter's greed laid bare in front of his entire donor base was a catastrophic blow to his empire. He was trying to find a way to distance himself, trying to figure out how to throw Chloe under the bus to save his own reputation. I stepped around Chloe's trembling, weeping form, refusing to offer her even a sliver of sympathy. She had happily worn the spoils of my stolen identity for 2 decades. She had laughed while I starved. The tears she was crying now were not tears of remorse. They were the tears of a predator caught in a trap she had willingly built for herself. I looked down at her, my expression completely unreadable. "You called me mentally unstable, Chloe," I said softly, the microphone picking up the quiet, lethal edge of my voice. "But the only insanity here was believing you could steal from the desperate, hide it behind a cross, and never be asked to balance the ledger. Your account is closed." I stepped away from her, leaving her huddled and broken on the stage. The second strike had landed flawlessly. Jamal was financially ruined. Chloe was socially and legally destroyed. The outer walls of the Sterling Empire had been completely obliterated, but the architect of the corruption was still standing. I turned my eyes back to Calvin Sterling. He was staring at me, breathing heavily, a bead of cold sweat rolling down his temple. The crowd was screaming, the cameras were rolling, and the stage was covered in the wreckage of his children. It was time for the final execution. Calvin snapped out of his catatonic stupor. The sheer survival instinct of a cornered predator finally overrode his shock. His face flushed a dark, violent crimson. He turned frantically toward the glass-enclosed audiovisual booth suspended at the back of the auditorium. He slashed his hand fiercely across his throat, signaling the technicians to cut the audio feed, to drop the screens, to plunge the stage into darkness. Nothing happened. The livestream icon in the corner of the massive LED displays continued to pulse a bright, steady red. My voice remained perfectly amplified. Calvin dropped his useless microphone. He spun toward the four armed security guards positioned at the base of the stage stairs. They were imposing men in dark suits hired to protect the Holy Empire from the very flock it fed upon. "Get him out of here!" Calvin roared, his voice cracking without electronic amplification. "Apprehend him right now. He is trespassing. Remove him from my stage." The guards did not flinch. They did not reach for their radios. They stood completely motionless, their hands clasped firmly behind their backs, their eyes fixed straight ahead. Patricia lunged forward, grabbing the sleeve of the nearest guard. "Do you not hear the pastor?" she screamed, her pristine facade entirely shattered, her face twisted in ugly, desperate panic. "Arrest him!" The guard gently but firmly removed her hand from his jacket. He stepped back and remained perfectly still. "Do not blame them, Calvin," I said, my voice echoing through the cavernous sanctuary. "They are private contractors, and they are simply following the direct orders of their employer. I purchased the parent company of your security firm 48 hours ago. They do not work for the Greater Light megachurch anymore. They work exclusively for me. And they have been explicitly instructed to allow this congregation to hear every single word I have to say." Calvin stumbled backward as if physically struck. The realization that every layer of his defense had been methodically stripped away hit him with paralyzing force. He looked around the massive 5,000-seat auditorium, realizing he was entirely trapped inside the very cage he had built to trap me. I raised the matte black remote. I aimed it at the screens and clicked the button one final time. The itemized receipts of Chloe's embezzlement vanished. The massive 40-foot LED displays went completely black. For a full 10 seconds, the stadium sat in heavy, suffocating darkness. Then a single stark image materialized on the screens. On the left side was a high-resolution photograph of a crumpled, faded $10 bill. On the right side were dozens of pages of unredacted federal credit fraud reports. The documents were highlighted, outlining an endless, staggering list of synthetic corporate identities, luxury retail accounts, and high-yield commercial credit lines. At the top of every single page was my legal name and my social security number. I turned to face the congregation. The silence in the room was absolute. 5,000 people sat paralyzed, unable to look away from the screens. The pastor you revere didn't just abandon his 9-year-old son at a bus stop with $10. I spoke, my voice ringing out with a cold, devastating clarity washing over the thousands of people who had worshipped this man for decades. He stole my name. For 23 years, he and the First Lady siphoned $850,000 in fraudulent credit under my social security number to buy the very suits they are wearing right now. A collective shudder ripped through the audience. "Look at the man standing before you," I commanded, gesturing toward Calvin, who was now trembling uncontrollably. "Look at the man who demands your tithes, who demands your unquestioning obedience, who claims to be the anointed shepherd of this community. He did not simply fail as a father. He did not simply make a tragic, regrettable mistake in his past. He functioned as a highly organized, systematic financial predator. He discarded a child because that child was inconvenient to his ambitions. But he kept the child's identity because it was highly profitable." I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, speaking directly to the sea of horrified faces. I wanted them to understand the sheer depth of the rot standing at their pulpit. While you were bowing your heads in prayer, your pastor was forging my signature on commercial loan applications. While you were volunteering your weekends to build this ministry, your pastor was routing stolen funds through an elaborate network of offshore shell companies to protect his own pristine credit score. While you were giving 10% of your hard-earned salaries to this church, hoping to buy favor with God, Calvin and Patricia Sterling were actively monetizing my absence. They transformed a discarded, unwanted boy into their own personal, endless automated teller machine. I turned my gaze back to my parents. Patricia was weeping violently, her hands covering her face, unable to look at the screens projecting her ultimate sin. Calvin looked like a hollow, empty shell. The booming, untouchable patriarch was gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered thief. "Every luxury car lease you drove," I said to them, my voice dropping to a lethal, piercing register. "Every custom-tailored suit you wore to stand on this holy stage. Every square inch of marble flooring in your Buckhead mansion. Every extravagant performative display of wealth you flaunted to convince these people of your divine favor. It was all financed by the systematic financial rape of an abandoned boy. You built this entire $50 million empire on the back of my stolen identity. You were absolutely confident that the disposable child you threw to the wolves would simply vanish, die, or end up incarcerated. You bet your entire kingdom on the assumption that I would be completely incapable of ever unearthing your massive 2-decade-long fraud. I let the words hang in the air, allowing the sheer calculated sociopathy of their actions to penetrate the minds of every single congregant, every local politician, and every media outlet watching the live stream. "You stood at this pulpit this morning," I continued, my eyes locked onto Calvin. "You dared to preach about the return of the prodigal son. You dared to use the sacred text to publicly corner me, hoping to coerce me into bailing out your bankrupt son-in-law and funding your vanity projects. You thought you could blind me with applause. You thought you could use this congregation as leverage, but you fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the man who walked through those doors today. I did not return to seek your forgiveness. I did not return to seek your validation. I returned to balance the ledger. And the cost of my blood is everything you possess." I turned to Xavier. He stepped forward with mechanical precision, opening the leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder and handed it to me. I held the folder up for the entire auditorium to see. "This is not a Bible," I stated softly. "These are property deeds. These are mortgage notes. These are the absolute, undeniable instruments of your destruction." I pulled the first heavy, watermarked document from the folder. "Last night I initiated a hostile takeover of the distressed asset division of Southern Heritage Trust. I purchased the toxic debt bundle containing the primary mortgage and the severely delinquent home equity line of credit for your Buckhead mansion. Because you failed to meet your last 2 payment obligations, I have exercised my legal right to call the entire loan due immediately. I own your home, Calvin. I own the roof over your head." I pulled the second document from the folder, holding it up into the blinding stage lights. "Furthermore, the fraudulent credit lines you opened in my name were intricately cross-collateralized with the commercial loans you used to build this very sanctuary. By weaponizing that fraud and initiating a catastrophic multi-jurisdictional identity theft lockdown with the federal credit bureaus, I have triggered a total default protocol on the Greater Light megachurch. The banks have frozen your operational accounts. Your creditors are currently seizing your liquid assets. The fractional private jet membership you used to fly your ministry team around the country was permanently revoked 3 hours ago. You have absolutely zero liquidity. You cannot access a single dollar of your stolen wealth." I stepped directly in front of Calvin. He was a broken man, shivering in his stolen suit, staring up at me with eyes completely hollowed out by terror. "I stand here not as a son, but as your sole creditor." The words hit him like physical blows. "You have 24 hours to vacate my properties. You will leave the Buckhead mansion. You will leave this church. You will leave the cars, the jewelry, and every single item purchased with my blood. You will walk out of those doors with exactly what you gave me at the bus stop. Nothing." I turned my back on him. I looked at Xavier, handing him the folder. "Xavier, please ensure the federal evidence dossiers and the drafted confession are delivered directly to the United States Attorney's Office immediately. Let the Department of Justice begin their RICO investigation. Let the world see what hides behind the cross. I dropped the microphone. It hit the acrylic stage floor with a heavy final thud that echoed through the silent stadium. I did not look back at Calvin. I did not look at Patricia weeping on the floor. I did not look at Chloe or Jamal. I simply turned and walked down the steps of the stage, moving with the same slow measured precision I had used when I arrived. The congregation parted like the Red Sea pulling back from the center aisle in stunned absolute silence. No one spoke. No one reached out. They simply watched the architect of their false prophet's destruction walk quietly out of the sanctuary, leaving the Sterling family empire burning in his wake. The heavy mahogany doors of the sanctuary slammed shut behind my back, sealing the chaotic screaming tribunal inside. The pristine climate-controlled atrium was dead quiet, but the atmosphere outside the towering glass walls was already alive with the harsh, aggressive strobe of red and blue emergency lights. Xavier had executed his final directive with immaculate, terrifying timing. As I stepped out into the crisp Sunday morning air, a massive fleet of black armored SUVs and marked federal cruisers swarmed the VIP parking lot. Men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers with FBI and IRS emblazoned in bold yellow letters moved with calculated military precision. They completely bypassed the standard church security checkpoints, fanning out to secure every exit of the sprawling $50 million complex. They established a hard perimeter shutting down the entire block. The doors to the main sanctuary burst open violently behind me. The congregation spilled out into the atrium, and the parking lot driven by a desperate, morbid curiosity to witness the final act of their fallen prophet. Local politicians and wealthy real estate developers scrambled to their luxury vehicles, frantically calling their public relations managers, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Calvin and Patricia emerged moments later. They were physically dragged out by my private security contractors, who immediately and ruthlessly handed them over to the waiting federal agents. There was no masterful defense. There was no spinning the narrative. Calvin Sterling, the booming voice of Atlanta's religious elite, was violently shoved face first against the hood of an armored federal vehicle. The crisp, midnight blue suit, bought with my stolen credit, crumpled as an FBI agent roughly wrenched his arms behind his back. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut with a sharp, echoing finality. His face was a mask of absolute hollow terror. Patricia was sobbing hysterically, screaming wild, incoherent pleas about a misunderstanding, as a female IRS agent calmly but forcefully recited her Miranda rights. The agent secured her wrists, forcing her perfectly manicured hands behind her back. They were officially under arrest for aggravated identity theft, systemic bank fraud, and multi-million-dollar wire fraud. The massive flock they had manipulated for decades watched in absolute horrified silence as their beloved pastor and pristine First Lady were aggressively shoved into the back of a federal cruiser like common street criminals. I stood beside my armored Maybach, watching the relentless legal machinery completely dismantle the remaining fragments of their lives. A sudden erratic flurry of movement caught my eye. Jamal was sprinting frantically across the manicured church lawn, abandoning the paved walkways entirely. He had shed his custom velvet jacket and thrown away his silk tie. He was running blindly toward the back service exit of the property, desperately fleeing the federal raid and the crushing, inescapable weight of his newly exposed bankruptcy. He did not look back at his wife. He did not attempt to help her. He simply ran, a pathetic, terrified coward abandoning a sinking ship. Chloe was left standing completely alone on the wide concrete steps of the megachurch. The elite socialites she had desperately tried to impress were actively backing away from her, treating her like a highly contagious disease. Her carefully curated social standing in Atlanta was instantly and permanently obliterated. She realized in real time the sheer magnitude of her ruin. Her husband had fled. Her parents were in federal custody. Her bank accounts were entirely locked. Her stolen empire was dust. She spotted me standing by the open door of the Maybach. The panic in her eyes morphed into sheer, unadulterated desperation. She scrambled down the concrete steps, her expensive designer heels clicking frantically against the pavement. She threw herself entirely onto the ground right beside the rear passenger door of my vehicle. "Isaiah!" she wailed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. Her hands desperately clawed at the polished exterior of the car. "Please, you have to stop this. We are family. We are your blood. I have nothing." Jamal left me. My cards are declining. I cannot even call a lawyer. Please, Isaiah, you have made your point. You won. I am begging you, please show us mercy. She fell completely to her knees, weeping bitterly onto the pristine asphalt. Her expensive makeup smeared across her cheeks, completely stripping away her arrogant plastic facade. She was a broken, sobbing mess, begging the very brother she had happily robbed for 2 decades. I looked down at her. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a single word of gloating or victory. Gloating required emotional investment, and I had absolutely none left to give her. I felt a profound, echoing emptiness when I looked at my sister. The ledger was finally permanently balanced. The transaction was complete. I did not offer forgiveness. Forgiveness was a currency they had bankrupted a long time ago. I simply opened the heavy armored door of the Maybach and slid into the quiet premium leather interior. I looked her in the eyes one final time, pressing the silver control button on the armrest. I watched her face contort in fresh, agonizing despair as the thick tinted glass smoothly rolled up, severing her completely from my world. "Drive, Xavier," I commanded softly. The heavy engine purred and the vehicle glided effortlessly out of the parking lot, leaving the Sterling family to drown entirely in the wreckage of their own making. 1 year later, the central air conditioning hummed softly in my downtown penthouse office, providing a steady, rhythmic white noise that grounded my thoughts. 12 months had passed since the federal raid at the Greater Light megachurch. The sprawling Atlanta skyline glowed brightly beneath my floor-to-ceiling smart glass windows, but the entire landscape of my life had fundamentally shifted. I stood by the glass holding a crystal tumbler of sparkling water, reflecting quietly on the absolute finality of the past year. The federal justice system had moved with ruthless, highly publicized efficiency. Calvin and Patricia Sterling were currently serving mandatory minimum sentences in separate federal penitentiaries, completely stripped of their wealth. Their fraudulent empire had been entirely dismantled and sold off at auction by the Department of Justice. Jamal Davenport was completely bankrupt, facing a barrage of civil lawsuits from angry creditors and permanently exiled from the Atlanta business sector. Chloe had finalized her divorce and was quietly working a minimum-wage retail job in a different state, trying desperately to outrun the massive public humiliation of her exposed embezzlement. But my focus was no longer locked on their destruction. My focus was entirely dedicated to creation. I had legally acquired the commercial deed to the Onyx Room and immediately ordered a heavy demolition crew to level the building. I personally watched the wrecking balls crush the velvet ropes and shatter the glass VIP booths, completely bulldozing the physical monument to Jamal's fake empire. The land was now a community green space completely cleared of toxic debt and vanity. The Greater Light mega church property had undergone an even more radical systemic transformation. Following the federal seizure and subsequent government auction, my holding company purchased the entire $50 million complex. I completely dismantled the massive sanctuary, ripping out the clear acrylic pulpits and the high-definition broadcast cameras used to manipulate the vulnerable. In its exact place, I built the Sterling Genesis Initiative. The sprawling facility had been entirely transformed into a state-of-the-art technology incubator, an educational campus designed exclusively for at-risk African-American youth from South Atlanta. The cavernous space where Calvin had preached empty promises was now filled with high-speed server racks, advanced coding laboratories, and comprehensive financial literacy classrooms. The youth annex expansion that he had used as a fraudulent fundraising tool was now a fully funded operational reality. It provided massive scholarships, direct mentorships, and actual tangible venture capital to brilliant kids who had been entirely discarded by the system. I had taken the exact weapon they used to destroy people and forged it into an unstoppable tool of absolute empowerment. I provided the exact security, the education, and the resources that the 14-year-old version of myself had desperately needed, but never received. I turned away from the sprawling city view and walked slowly over to my massive mahogany desk. The dark surface was clean organized and entirely clear of unnecessary corporate clutter, except for one specific, highly significant item resting perfectly in the center. It was a thick, pristine block of flawless optical crystal. Encased directly inside the heavy transparent glass was a single, faded crumpled $10 bill. I reached out, resting my fingertips lightly against the cool, smooth surface of the crystal. I traced the outline of the old, worn currency. It was the exact bill Calvin had shoved into my hand at the Greyhound bus station 23 years ago. It was the absolute lowest point of my entire existence, the exact physical marker of the moment I had been thrown away like garbage. Now it was completely powerless. It was a museum piece. It was a silent relic of a brutal war I had conclusively won. I looked at the $10 bill, feeling the quiet, rhythmic hum of the servers down the hall and the distant, vibrant energy of the city outside my expansive windows. The cold, impenetrable armor of pure rage that I had worn tightly for 2 decades was finally gone. I did not feel the burning, toxic need for vengeance anymore. The fire had burned itself out, leaving behind a clear, unobstructed path forward. I felt something entirely different. I took a deep, measured breath, letting the clean, conditioned air fill my lungs. A profound, unshakable quiet settled deeply into my bones. I was completely at peace. I was not at peace because I had systematically destroyed the people who hurt me. I was at peace because I had finally definitively survived them.